Picture this, you're flipping through a dusty, leather-bound history book, the kind you'd find tucked away in the forgotten corner of a library. The pages are filled with the usual names: the presidents, the generals, the celebrated inventors. But then your finger stops on a photograph. It's a man in a suit, standing proudly next to a large metallic chicken. Yes, a chicken, and according to the caption, this wasn't a sculpture or a prop. He claimed it was a fully functioning, steam-powered poultry companion designed to revolutionize farming. His name has been lost to time, his story buried under the weight of more important events. But his wild ambition, his glorious, bizarre dream, is a perfect reminder that the true tapestry of American history isn't just woven with threads of victory and politics. It's also stitched together with the strange, the peculiar, and the utterly unforgettable characters whose stories were simply too weird for the mainstream narrative. History, as we often learn it, can feel like a polished, well-rehearsed play. We know the lead actors and the major plot points. But what about the supporting cast, the eccentrics, the visionaries, the outright oddballs who operated in the shadows and margins? Their contributions, their wild experiments, and their spectacular failures add a layer of richness and color to our past that is often overlooked. They challenge our perceptions, make us laugh, and sometimes make us wonder what on earth they were thinking. These are the figures who dared to imagine a different world, even if that world included mechanical chickens or schemes to communicate with Martian civilizations. Their stories are not just footnotes, they are vital, vibrant chapters in the story of a nation built on ambition, ingenuity, and, let's be honest, a healthy dose of strangeness. So today, we're setting aside the well-trodden path. We're going on a journey into the forgotten corners of the American experience to meet the weirdest historical figures you've never heard of. We will uncover the tales of individuals whose lives were so peculiar, so audaciously strange, that you'll wonder how they ever slipped through the cracks of our collective memory. From inventors of impossible machines to cult leaders with baffling philosophies, these are the people who prove that reality is often far more fascinating than fiction. So get comfortable, open your mind to the wonderfully odd, and join us as we step into the bizarre and captivating world of America's most overlooked historical characters. Our journey into the peculiar begins not with a mechanical chicken, but with a different kind of fabrication, one that soared all the way to the heavens. In the sweltering summer of 1835, the city of New York was gripped by a story so extraordinary it seemed to defy the very laws of nature. The source was the New York Sun, a relatively new penny paper, and the author was a quiet, unassuming English journalist named Richard Adams Locke. What he set in motion would become one of the most audacious and successful media hoaxes in American history, a testament to the potent mix of scientific curiosity and human gullibility. It began subtly with a small announcement claiming the famous astronomer Sir John Herschel had made monumental discoveries at his observatory in South Africa using a powerful new telescope. The public's interest was piqued. Then, over the course of 6 days, the Sun published a series of articles that grew more fantastical with each installment. Readers were told that Herschel had observed vast forests, pristine oceans, and violet-colored quartz pyramids on the lunar surface. The articles were rich with what sounded like authentic scientific jargon, describing phosphoric, light, and red-flowering shrubs, lending an air of undeniable credibility to the outlandish claims. But the true sensation came with the description of the moon's inhabitants. The articles detailed herds of miniature, single-horned bison, bearded blue goats that walked upright, and spherical, rolling amphibians. The piece de resistance, however, was the discovery of intelligent life, a race of furry, winged humanoids Locke dubbed the Vespertilio Homo, or the Batmen of the Moon. These creatures, he wrote, built temples, engaged in conversation, and even exhibited romantic behaviors. The descriptions were so vivid, so meticulously detailed, that they bypassed skepticism and landed directly in the realm of wonder. The public's reaction was nothing short of phenomenal. the Sun's circulation exploded, making it for a time the most widely read newspaper in the world. The story was reprinted across the country and even in Europe. Lectures were given to packed halls, illustrating the lunar discoveries. Clergymen reportedly began preparing sermons on the theological implications of life on other worlds. The hoax had tapped into a perfect storm of factors: a growing public fascination with science and exploration, a lack of widespread scientific literacy, and the competitive, often sensationalist, nature of the burgeoning penny press. People weren't just reading the news, they were experiencing it, believing they were witnessing a new age of discovery firsthand. So, what drove Richard Adams Locke to create such an elaborate fiction? His motivations remain shrouded in some mystery, but historians have proposed several compelling theories. Some suggest it was a satirical jab at the wild, speculative astronomical theories that were popular at the time, particularly those of a German astronomer who claimed to have seen structures on the moon. Locke, a well-educated man, may have been mocking what he saw as scientific charlatanism by taking its premises to their most ludicrous extreme. Others argue it was a more straightforward commercial endeavor, a brilliant scheme to sell newspapers in a cutthroat market. There's also the possibility it was a combination of both a cynical yet clever demonstration of how easily the public could be manipulated, all while profiting handsomely from the deception. The hoax eventually unraveled when other newspapers grew suspicious and could not verify the sources. Locke himself eventually admitted his authorship, though his explanations for why he did it remained vague. Yet the legacy of the Great Moon hoax endures. It stands as a powerful, early lesson in media literacy, a cautionary tale about the need to question sensational claims, no matter how authoritative they may seem. Richard Adams Locke, this quiet journalist, didn't just sell papers. He demonstrated the awesome power of a good story, proving that sometimes the most incredible characters in history aren't the ones who change the world through action, but those who change our perception of it through pure, unadulterated imagination. Now let's turn our attention from the cosmic deceptions of the printed page to a mystery that walked the earth, a solitary figure whose regular appearances became as predictable as the seasons for the people of rural Connecticut and New York. If you were a resident of a small town along a particular 365-mile loop in the late 19th century, you could set your calendar by him. Every 34 days, like clockwork, he would appear. He was a man entirely encased in a handmade suit of heavy leather, from his patched-together coat and trousers down to his crude, hood-like cap, which he rarely removed. To the locals, he was known simply as the Leather Man. His existence was one of profound solitude and rigid routine. For over 3 decades, from approximately 1857 until his death in 1889, he walked his circuit, stopping at the same farmhouses and caves for shelter and sustenance. He rarely spoke, communicating mostly through gestures and the occasional, quiet merci when offered food, a clue to his believed French-Canadian origins. He survived on the charity of the families along his route, who would leave out meals for him, knowing he would arrive on his precise schedule. He became a familiar, if unsettling, fixture. Children might watch for him from windows with a mix of fear and fascination, while adults accepted his presence as a strange, immutable part of their world. He was not a beggar, but a silent participant in a quiet, unspoken pact with the communities he passed through. Of course, a character this enigmatic was bound to spawn countless theories. Who was this man, and what tragedy or madness could have driven him to such an extreme life? The most widely accepted story, one that he apparently confirmed on the rare occasions he spoke, identified him as Jules Berglet from Lyon, France. According to this legend, Berglet was a young man from a poor family who fell in love with the daughter of a wealthy leather merchant. To prove himself worthy, he was given a job in the merchant's firm, but he made a catastrophic error in a leather purchase that bankrupted the business. The merchant died of shock, the heartbroken daughter entered a convent, and a despondent Berglet, consumed by guilt, sailed to America and fashioned his penitential suit from the very material that had caused his ruin. It's a powerful, romantic tale, a 19th-century melodrama played out on the back roads of New England. Yet, modern research has cast significant doubt on this narrative. Historians have found no record of a Jules Bergley or a corresponding leather business failure in Lyon. A more plausible theory, supported by census records and other documents, suggests he was actually a French-Canadian named Jules Laroche, who may have suffered a profound personal loss, perhaps the death of a loved one that triggered a deep psychological break and sent him on his lifelong pilgrimage. His leather suit, weighing nearly 60 pounds, wasn't just eccentricity. It was a mobile shelter, a protective shell against the elements, and a physical manifestation of the emotional armor he had built around himself. It was his home, his identity, and his burden, all stitched together. The local legends only grew with time. Some whispered he was a nobleman in hiding. Others claimed he had a vast fortune sewn into the patches of his leather suit. His predictability, however, made him vulnerable. In 1888, a year before his death, he was finally persuaded to break from his route and was examined by a doctor who found him suffering from facial cancer, likely caused by a lifetime of exposure. He was committed to an almshouse for a short time, but he was so disoriented and distressed by the disruption to his routine that he was released, and he immediately returned to his worn path. He was found dead in one of his caves the following spring, a victim of his cancer and the harsh winter. In the end, the leather man remains a poignant and haunting figure, a reminder of the invisible lines between solitude and loneliness, between eccentricity and profound trauma. His story is not one of hoaxes or inventions, but of a real, tangible human mystery whose silent, leather-clad journey continues to captivate anyone who wonders about the quiet, unseen lives that have passed just outside our doorsteps. While the leather man represents a story of solitary mystery, our next character presents a nearly opposite spectacle, a man whose eccentricity was not a private burden, but a public performance that an entire city came to embrace and celebrate. From the silent, winding roads of New England, we travel to the booming, boisterous city of San Francisco during the late 1800s, a place of rapid growth, wild ambition, and spectacular fortunes won and lost overnight. It was here that a man named Joshua Abraham Norton experienced a catastrophic financial reversal that would have broken most people. Instead, it launched him on a path to becoming one of America's most beloved and benevolent monarchs, the one and only Emperor Norton I. Before his imperial reign, Joshua Norton was a successful and respected businessman. He arrived in San Francisco during the gold rush, not as a miner, but as a savvy merchant, and he quickly amassed a fortune of $250,000, a colossal sum for the era. His downfall was as dramatic as his rise. Believing he could control the market, he invested his entire wealth in cornering the region's rice supply, anticipating a shortage. Instead, several ships loaded with rice suddenly arrived in the port, causing the price to collapse instantly. Norton was ruined. He spent the next several years embroiled in lawsuits and vanished from public life, presumably to lick his wounds in poverty and obscurity. Most stories would have ended there with a broken man and a failed gamble, but Joshua Norton was not most men. He re-emerged in September 1859, not as a bankrupt businessman, but as a self-proclaimed sovereign. He marched into the offices of the San Francisco Bulletin and delivered a proclamation which the paper, perhaps amused by the audacity, printed. It read, in part, at the peremptory request and desire of a large majority of the citizens of these United States, I, Joshua Norton, declare and proclaim myself Emperor of these United States. A later proclamation would add the title, Protector of Mexico. The city, with its unique sense of humor and frontier spirit, decided to play along. And so began the 21-year reign of Emperor Norton I. His proclamations, issued regularly to the press, were a blend of startling foresight, whimsical governance, and profound sanity. He wasn't merely a madman shouting at the sky. He was a performance artist whose work held up a mirror to society. He famously decreed the dissolution of the United States Congress, citing widespread corruption and dysfunction. He ordered the construction of a suspension bridge and a tunnel connecting Oakland and San Francisco, a visionary idea that would much later become the San Francisco-Oakland Bay Bridge and the Trans-Bay Tube. He commanded that a League of Nations be formed to resolve international disputes peacefully. Decades before the actual League was conceived, he even declared that no denomination of the word Frisco be used, a rule many locals still abide by today. His edicts were often published in full, and while they had no legal power, they carried a strange moral authority, frequently pointing out the failings and possibilities of the actual government with remarkable clarity. Emperor Norton also understood the practical needs of his station. He issued his own currency in the form of scrip or bonds to fund his imperial activities. These notes in denominations of 50 cents up to $10 were honored by the city's restaurants, theaters, and shops. They were accepted not out of fear, but out of affection, and many businesses considered it good luck to have one of the emperor's bonds displayed in their window. He wore an elaborate military uniform with gold epaulettes given to him by officers at the Presidio Army base, and topped his ensemble with a beaver hat adorned with a peacock feather. He would inspect the city's sidewalks, police officers, and public property with a solemn sense of duty, offering critiques and commendations. The people of San Francisco didn't just tolerate him, they cherished him. He was a civic institution. When his uniform became shabby, the City Board of Supervisors appropriated funds for a new one. He ate for free at the finest restaurants, and he had complimentary tickets to every theater opening. In return, he provided a sense of wonder, kindness, and unity. He was known to mediate street disputes and was a great friend of the Chinese immigrant community, often patrolling Chinatown to protect its residents from violence and prejudice, once famously positioning himself between an angry mob and a group of Chinese laborers and reciting the Lord's Prayer until the mob dispersed. His presence was a daily reminder that a community is defined not just by its laws, but by its compassion and its capacity for joy. When he passed away in January 1880, the city came to a standstill. Tens of thousands of people, nearly 30,000 by some accounts, lined the streets for his funeral procession, a tribute fit for an actual king. Newspapers across the country reported on the death of the beloved emperor. He was a man who had lost everything in the conventional world, only to build a kingdom of the heart in the most unconventional way, a testament to the power of a city's collective imagination to lift someone up and crown them with genuine, enduring affection. From the benevolent reign of Emperor Norton, we journey now to a world of mysticism and power, where the line between spiritual leader and city legend blurs into the humid air of 19th century New Orleans. Here, in a city famed for its vibrant and often dark history, one name echoes through the cobblestone streets and above the din of the French Quarter with an enduring power that transcends time itself: Marie Laveau. To understand her, one must first navigate the intricate web of fact and folklore, for she exists in the collective memory as both a flesh and blood woman and an almost supernatural force, the legendary Voodoo Queen. The historical Marie Laveau was a free woman of color, a devout Catholic, and a hairdresser to the city's wealthy elite. This last profession was far more significant than it might initially appear. In the intimate space of a lady's dressing room, while styling elaborate coiffures, Marie was privy to the most guarded secrets of New Orleans high society. She heard whispers of infidelity, financial ruin, political intrigue, and desperate personal scandals. This access to clandestine information became the foundation of her perceived power. When she would later offer a spiritual reading or provide a gris bag, a small charm for protection or luck, her insights would often be startlingly accurate, not because of magic, but because of the intelligence gathered in her day job. She was a master of understanding human nature and leveraging knowledge, operating at the intersection of the spiritual and the social worlds of the city. Her public persona, however, was built on the dramatic rituals she was said to lead, most famously at Bayou St. John on the shore of Lake Pontchartrain. These gatherings, attended by both black and white New Orleanians from all social classes, were a potent mix of African, Catholic, and Caribbean spiritual traditions. Participants would dance to hypnotic drum beats, seek spiritual intercession, and witness Laveau herself, who was said to dance with her snake named Zombi, a powerful symbol of the voodoo deity Dambala. These spectacles solidified her reputation as a figure of immense authority, a priestess who could commune with the spirits to heal the sick, curse enemies, and influence the outcomes of court cases, a skill for which she became particularly famous. It was this combination of genuine spiritual leadership and masterful public performance that cemented her status as the undisputed queen. The myth of Marie Laveau, however, has only grown in the century since her death in 1881. Today, her supposed tomb in St. Louis Cemetery No. 1 is one of the most visited sites in New Orleans, a place of pilgrimage for thousands. Visitors follow a ritual of marking 3 X's on the tomb, turning around 3 times, knocking on the slab, and leaving an offering, be it coins, rum, candles, or Mardi Gras beads, while making a wish. The tomb is perpetually adorned with these tokens, a vibrant, chaotic testament to the enduring faith in her power. This practice, while not rooted in any documented voodoo tradition, speaks to the human desire for connection, for hope, and for a touch of the miraculous. It shows how a historical figure can transform into a timeless symbol, her legacy continually reshaped and renewed by the beliefs of those who follow. What is perhaps most fascinating is how the story of Marie Laveau has evolved, often conflating her with her daughter, also named Marie Laveau. The second Marie Laveau was said to be more flamboyant and commercially minded, and over time, the exploits of mother and daughter have merged in the public imagination, creating a single, composite, and seemingly immortal Voodoo Queen. This blending of generations only adds to the mystique, making it nearly impossible to separate the woman from the myth. Her legacy is not merely one of spells and conjuring, it is a story of a marginalized woman who carved out a position of immense influence in a rigidly hierarchical society. She was a community leader who provided spiritual comfort, a shrewd businesswoman who understood the economics of desire and fear, and a cultural icon who helped define the very soul of New Orleans. Her power endures not just in the whispered wishes at her tomb, but in the rhythm of the city itself, a permanent reminder that history's most compelling figures are often those who master the delicate art of weaving reality and enchantment into an irresistible and enduring tapestry. But from the mystical world of Marie Laveau, we travel now to the raw American frontier, a landscape of immense possibility and hardship. Here, another figure of folklore and fact emerges, a man whose story has been polished into a gentle children's fable. We all know the image, a gentle soul wandering the wilderness, scattering apple seeds from a burlap sack, a tin pot resting comfortably on his head. While this charming caricature contains a kernel of truth, the real John Chapman, the man we call Johnny Appleseed, was a far more complex, strategic, and fascinating character than the simple folktale suggests. The first thing to understand about John Chapman's mission is that he was not merely a wandering philanthropist beautifying the wilderness. He was a shrewd, forward-thinking businessman operating within a very specific legal framework. In the early 1800s, the Northwest Territory had laws designed to encourage settlement. A person could claim a parcel of land by demonstrating they were making improvements to it, and one of the most recognized forms of improvement was the planting of an orchard. This was Chapman's brilliant scheme. He would identify promising plots along the edge of settlement, often near future towns or along known travel routes like rivers. He would clear a small patch of land, plant hundreds of apple seeds, carefully gathered from cider mills back east, and surround the nascent nursery with a crude brush fence. By doing this, he was staking a legal claim. He would then leave the nursery to grow for a few years while he moved on to establish another one, creating a network of orchards across Pennsylvania, Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois. Later, he would return, sell the established seedlings to arriving settlers, and use the proceeds to fund his next expedition. This wasn't random planting, it was a calculated, sprawling real estate and nursery enterprise that anticipated the wave of westward expansion. His appearance, while eccentric, was also a testament to his resourcefulness and beliefs. The stories of him wearing a coffee sack for a shirt and using his cooking pot as a hat are largely accurate. But this wasn't mere poverty or madness. It was a deliberate rejection of material vanity, a philosophy deeply rooted in his religious convictions. Chapman was a devout, traveling missionary of the Church of the New Jerusalem, a Christian denomination based on the writings of Emanuel Swedenborg. Swedenborgianism emphasized a life of charity, a closeness to nature as a reflection of the divine, and a belief in the spiritual world being intimately connected to our own. For Chapman, his simple attire and nomadic lifestyle were expressions of his faith. He saw himself as an instrument of God's providence, and his apple trees were not just for food, but symbols of sustenance and peace. As he traveled, he would often stop at cabins and settlements, not just to sell seedlings, but to share passages from his Swedenborgian texts, which he called good news fresh from heaven. He was as much a sower of spiritual ideas as he was of apple seeds. His legendary kindness extended profoundly to the animal kingdom, and here the stories, while often romanticized, appear to be grounded in fact. He was a strict vegetarian for the latter part of his life, believing it was wrong to cause any living creature suffering. Tales abound of him purchasing a lame horse from a farmer just to give it a peaceful retirement, or of him extinguishing his campfire upon seeing mosquitoes fly into the flames, lamenting that they too valued their lives. On one famous occasion, he was said to have spent an entire night talking to a bear that was threatening his campsite, not with aggression, but with a calm, persuasive appeal to live in harmony, and by morning, the bear had supposedly wandered away. These anecdotes paint a picture of a man who genuinely saw himself as part of a unified, living world, not as a master of it. His relationship with nature was not one of conquest, but of communion. And what of the apples themselves? It's crucial to dispel a common misconception. The apples from John Chapman's trees were not the sweet, crisp, eating varieties we find in supermarkets today. They were small, tart, and for the most part, incredibly bitter when raw. They were what were known as spitters, because taking a bite would likely make you spit it out immediately. But these apples had a much more important purpose. They were perfect for making hard cider. In an era when water safety was often questionable, hard cider was a safe, stable, and vital source of hydration and nutrition for frontier families. Every part of the apple was useful, and a well-established orchard was a cornerstone of a homestead's self-sufficiency. Chapman wasn't planting for pie, he was planting for survival, providing the literal seeds for a stable life on the frontier. John Chapman died in 1845, having become a beloved and respected figure across the region he helped cultivate. He was a mosaic of contradictions, a successful businessman who owned over 1,200 acres of orchards, yet lived in apparent poverty, a deeply religious missionary who was universally welcomed by people of all faiths, and a mythical figure who was also a very real, tangible presence in the lives of thousands of settlers. The legend of Johnny Appleseed simplifies him into a harmless, gentle wanderer, but the real man was so much more compelling. He was a visionary who saw the future map of America and helped plant it, one bitter, indispensable apple at a time, all while walking a path guided by a unique and powerful set of spiritual principles that made him one of the frontier's most successful and enduring eccentrics. Our exploration of American eccentrics now takes a sharp turn from the benevolent and the mystical into the heart of a genuine, sensational crime, where the line between witness and performer became dangerously blurred. In the early morning hours of September 16, 1922, in the quiet town of New Brunswick, New Jersey, a farmer and a minister made a gruesome discovery in a local lover's lane known as De Russey's Lane. Lying beneath a crabapple tree were the bodies of Edward Hall, a prominent Episcopal priest, and Eleanor Mills, a singer in his church choir. Both had been shot, and Mrs. Mills' throat had been slit so deeply she was nearly decapitated. Scattered around them were love letters the two had written to each other, exposing a long-running affair. The Hall-Mills murder case had all the ingredients for a national sensation: adultery, religion, and high society. But for 4 years, the investigation went cold, stymied by a lack of evidence, and many argued a reluctance by authorities to pursue the wealthy and well-connected Hall family. The case would only crack open with the appearance of a witness so strange, so theatrical, and so utterly unforgettable that she would eclipse the victims themselves in the public's imagination. Her name was Jane Gibson, but the world would come to know her by a far more peculiar moniker, the Pig Woman. Jane Gibson was a 38-year-old widow who lived with her mother on a farm bordering the murder site. She earned her nickname honestly, raising and selling pigs to make ends meet. She was not a figure of high society. She was a tough, weathered woman of the soil, and it was this very background that would make her testimony so compelling to some and so questionable to others. In the fall of 1926, with the case reopened under immense public pressure, Gibson came forward with a story she claimed to have held back for years out of fear. On the night of the murder, she explained, she had been riding her mule, Jenny, through the fields near de Russey's Lane, checking on her corn crop, which she suspected was being stolen. It was then, she swore, that she heard voices, angry, arguing voices, followed by the distinct, unmistakable sound of gunshots. Spurring her mule closer to the scene, she claimed she witnessed a shocking tableau illuminated by the moonlight and a suddenly struck match. Her description was vivid and horrifying. She stated she saw 4 figures, a woman with white hair whom she identified as Mrs. Frances Hall, the Reverend's widow, kneeling over the body of Eleanor Mills and uttering the chilling words, "Explain these letters." She described another woman, identified as the Hall's sister, Willie Stevens, standing by, and a man she said was Mrs. Hall's brother, Henry Carpenter. It was a story that pointed the finger directly at the cuckolded wife and her family, a classic revenge narrative that the public and prosecutors were eager to believe. The press, particularly the sensationalist tabloids of the era, seized upon Jane Gibson. She was no longer just a witness, she was a character. They played up her rustic demeanor, her reliance on her mule for transportation, and of course, her profession. The Pig Woman was born, and she became an instant celebrity, her every move chronicled and her every word printed. The true spectacle, however, was yet to come. As the trial of Mrs. Hall, Willie Stevens, and Henry Carpenter commenced, Jane Gibson's health deteriorated. She was suffering from a serious and ultimately fatal condition, a malignancy that left her bedridden. The prosecution, desperate for their star witness's testimony, made an unprecedented decision. They moved the entire court, judge, jury, defendants, lawyers, and reporters, to Jane Gibson's bedside in her tiny, cramped farmhouse. The scene was surreal, a macabre theater of justice. Reporters crammed into the room, jostling for a view, while the formalities of the court were conducted in a space that smelled of medicine and the nearby pig pens. Propped up on pillows, Jane Gibson repeated her story, her voice weak but determined. She described the heavy-set woman and the gunshots, her testimony punctuated by moments of dramatic agony where she would moan and clutch her side. It was a performance for the ages, blurring the lines between sworn testimony and deathbed confession, and it captivated a nation listening on their new radios. Yet, for all its drama, her testimony was riddled with inconsistencies and problems. Defense attorneys quickly went to work, poking holes in her timeline and her physical ability to have witnessed what she claimed from the distance she described. They highlighted how her story had evolved and become more detailed over time, suggesting it had been shaped by the extensive newspaper coverage of the case. Most damningly, they questioned her motives, implying she was seeking fame or a potential financial reward. The core of the case now rested not on physical evidence, but on the credibility of this dying, theatrical pig woman. Was she a brave, honest citizen coming forward with the truth despite her humble station and failing health? Or was she a cunning, attention-seeking fabulist, constructing a grand narrative to insert herself into one of the decade's biggest stories? The jury ultimately found the defendants not guilty, a verdict that many interpreted as a direct rejection of Jane Gibson's bizarre and uncorroborated testimony. Jane Gibson died just a few months after the trial, her name forever intertwined with the unsolved murders. Her legacy is a complex one in the annals of American true crime. She represents the powerful and sometimes dangerous role of the eccentric witness, the person whose unique character can either illuminate a case or hopelessly obscure it. The Pig Woman was not a hoaxer like Richard Adams Locke, nor a benevolent monarch like Emperor Norton. She was a real person who, whether out of a desire for justice, a craving for attention, or a blend of both, stepped from the shadows of her farm and into the blinding spotlight of a national obsession, forever reminding us that in the search for truth, the most memorable character is not always the most reliable one. While the tragic drama of the Hall Mills case unfolded in a New Jersey courtroom, a very different kind of spectacle was playing out under the ornate dome of the United States Capitol, one that traded murder and scandal for a far more universal and far more relatable human failing, sheer, unadulterated exhaustion. In the late 19th century, the halls of Congress were populated by the usual mix of orators, deal-makers, and party loyalists, but among them sat a senator from Virginia whose claim to fame was not a landmark bill or a fiery speech, but his remarkable ability to fall soundly asleep at his desk. His name was William Alexander Scott, and while he may not have intended it, he became a national symbol, immortalized not for his politics, but for his naps. The phenomenon of the sleeping senator truly captured the public's imagination through the vibrant and often merciless medium of political cartoons. In an era before television or the internet, newspapers and illustrated weeklies were the primary source of visual commentary, and artists like Thomas Nast and Joseph Kepler wielded immense influence. They found in Senator Scott a perfect subject. One particularly famous cartoon depicted a slumbering Scott at his desk while the rotunda of the Capitol transforms into a massive bedroom around him, complete with other senators tiptoeing past in nightgowns and holding candles. Another showed the goddess of liberty gently placing a blanket over the dozing senator, a mix of gentle mockery and almost maternal pity. These images were reprinted across the country, making Scott's face, often rendered with a comically peaceful expression, his chin resting on his chest, instantly recognizable. He was no longer an individual politician. He was a caricature, a walking, or rather sleeping, punchline about the perceived lethargy and irrelevance of congressional debate. Far from being humiliated by this national ridicule, Senator Scott offered a defense that was as unexpected as it was brilliantly insightful. He didn't deny the accusations. Instead, he leaned into them with a dose of self-deprecating wit and sharp political commentary. He reportedly stated that he would rather have his constituents know he was sleeping during a dull speech than to have them think he was actually listening to and agreeing with such nonsense. This wasn't just a clever quip, it was a strategic masterstroke. He reframed his napping not as a sign of laziness or neglect, but as a silent protest against the endless, windy oratory that clogged the legislative process. He positioned himself as a man of action, or at least of inaction, who refused to lend false importance to what he considered empty rhetoric. In doing so, he turned a personal vulnerability into a critique of the entire system, suggesting that the real scandal wasn't his closed eyes, but the waste of time and taxpayer money that prompted them. Scott's story opens a fascinating window into the realities of 19th century political life, which were far more grueling than the dignified portraits of statesmen might suggest. Congressional sessions were notoriously long, often stretching through the night, with no air conditioning to combat the stifling Washington summers. The speeches themselves could be epic marathons lasting for 6, 8, or even 12 hours, filled with dense legal arguments, classical allusions, and theatrical grandstanding. For a senator from a previous generation who may have been older and less accustomed to such endurance tests, it's little wonder that the combination of warm, stuffy air and droning voices would act as a powerful sedative. His napping, then, can be seen less as a character flaw and more as a simple, physiological response to an exhausting and often monotonous professional environment. He was the human embodiment of the audience's own boredom, a silent rebel in a world of hot air. Ultimately, the legacy of Senator William Scott challenges our modern notions of political productivity and public perception. In today's world of relentless media scrutiny and 24/7 news cycles, a politician caught napping would likely be forced into a humiliating public apology or become the target of a devastating attack ad. But in the Gilded Age, there was a strange tolerance, even a certain affection for such human eccentricity. Scott's colleagues largely took his napping in stride, and his constituents kept re-electing him, suggesting they either agreed with his critique or simply found it harmless. His story reminds us that politics has always been a theater of the absurd as much as a forum for serious debate, and that sometimes the most honest reaction to the proceedings is a peaceful, unapologetic snooze. He remains a timeless figure, not for the laws he passed, but for the quiet, relatable truth he represented, that even in the halls of power, everyone needs a good nap now and then. From the sleepy halls of Congress, we travel to the heartland of Ohio, where a different kind of public spectacle captivated the nation, one born not from choice, but from a rare and confounding medical condition. In the late 1800s, in the town of Seneca County, lived a woman named Fanny Mills. To her friends and neighbors, she was a kind, intelligent, and well-liked member of the community. But to the wider world, she was known by a more sensational name, the human ostrich, a title bestowed upon her due to a pair of legs that measured a staggering 42 inches around each calf and featured feet so enlarged they were often compared to the two-toed appendages of the giant bird. Fanny suffered from Milroy's disease, a rare congenital condition known today as primary lymphedema, which causes a debilitating and visible accumulation of lymphatic fluid in the body's tissues. Life with this condition was a daily trial of immense physical and social hardship. The sheer weight of her legs, which together were said to weigh over 100 pounds, made walking an exhausting ordeal. She relied on custom-built furniture and a specially constructed wagon to move about. In an era without effective medical treatments, the swelling was constant and unrelenting, requiring meticulous care to prevent painful infections and skin breakdown. But beyond the physical discomfort was the relentless public scrutiny. In her own small town, she was known and accepted, but venturing beyond its borders meant facing a gauntlet of stares, whispers, and outright cruelty. The world was not built for a body like hers, and the social stigma was a heavy burden to bear. Yet in a remarkable pivot, Fanny and her husband, William, decided to confront that gaze head-on. Instead of hiding from the world, they would step directly into the spotlight, transforming her body from a source of shame into a source of income and a curious form of celebrity. They joined the sprawling, chaotic world of traveling carnival sideshows, a uniquely American institution where the unusual was commodified and displayed for a paying public. Billed as the Ohio Bigfoot Girl, or the human ostrich, Fanny became a featured attraction. For a dime or a quarter, patrons would file past her platform to listen as a carnival barker, or often her own husband, William, would detail the marvels and mysteries of her condition. The presentation was a careful blend of sensationalism and supposed medical education. They would display her custom-made boots, which were colossal in size and became a central prop in the act. The narrative crafted around her was crucial. She was not portrayed as a monster or an object of pity, but as a dignified woman facing an extraordinary medical circumstance. This presentation allowed the public to gawk, but within a framework that granted her a degree of respect and agency. She answered questions directly, spoke about her life, and in doing so, she controlled the narrative of her own body in a way that was almost unheard of for people with visible differences at the time. The public's fascination operated on two distinct levels. On one hand, there was the simple, undeniable draw of the bizarre, the same impulse that fuels reality television today. People were curious to see something they could not see anywhere else. On the other hand, there was a genuine, if primitive, thirst for medical knowledge. In an age before widespread public health education, sideshows often functioned as informal classrooms for human anatomy and pathology. For many attendees, seeing a person with elephantiasis was their first and only exposure to such a condition. Fanny's exhibit, in its own strange way, demystified her disability, making it a tangible, if still startling, reality rather than a whispered-about myth. This dual role, as both a spectacle and an inadvertent educator, placed her in a complex position, navigating the fine line between exploitation and empowerment. Financially, the decision was a resounding success. Fanny Mills and her husband earned a small fortune for the era, with some reports suggesting they brought in over $100 a day. a staggering sum when the average worker might earn 1 or 2. With this money, they did something extraordinary. They bought a beautiful, large home in Fostoria, Ohio, and became local philanthropists. Fanny was known for her immense generosity, buying bicycles for neighborhood children, donating to churches, and providing financial help to families who had fallen on hard times. She used the wealth generated by the public's curiosity about her body to become a pillar of her community, fundamentally altering her social standing from an object of pity to a respected and beloved benefactor. Her home became a local landmark, a symbol of her success and her resilient spirit. Her personal life, too, defied the expectations of the era. Her marriage to William Mills was by all accounts a loving and devoted partnership. He was not her manager in a cold, business-like sense. He was her protector, her companion, and her steadfast support system, fiercely defending her from anyone who sought to treat her with less than full respect. Their relationship stood as a powerful testament to the fact that love and companionship could flourish far outside the narrow boundaries of conventional physicality. Tragically, Fanny's life was cut short. She passed away in her late 20s, around 1889, from complications related to her condition. Her story, however, did not end there. In a final, macabre chapter that underscores the intense medical curiosity surrounding her, her legs were reportedly preserved by a local doctor for further study, a sobering reminder of the objectification that lingered even in death. Fanny Mills's legacy is a poignant and complicated tapestry of human resilience. She was a woman who took the cards she was dealt, a painful, life-altering condition, and played them with astonishing grace and business savvy. She harnessed the public's morbid curiosity and channeled it into financial independence, community respect, and a lasting legacy that challenges us to rethink the boundaries between disability, spectacle, and dignity. From the poignant story of Fanny Mills, we venture now into the truly outrageous, where medical desperation meets pure, unadulterated charlatanism. If you thought the previous figures were eccentric, prepare yourself for a man who turned quackery into an empire, a figure so brazen he built a fortune and nearly seized political power by promising to restore male virility with the most improbable ingredient, the testicles of a goat. His name was Dr. John R. Brinkley, and his story is a masterclass in 20th century deception, a perfect storm of pseudoscience, revolutionary media, and the timeless human fear of aging and decline. Brinkley's journey to becoming the infamous Goat Gland Doctor was as dubious as his methods. He purchased his medical degree from a disreputable, unaccredited institution known as the Eclectic Medical University of Kansas City, a diploma mill that required little more than a payment in exchange for a license to practice. He set up his first clinic in the small town of Milford, Kansas, and it was here in 1918 that he had his monstrous inspiration. According to his own embellished legend, a local farmer named Bill Stitsworth came to him complaining of a lack of energy and a diminished sex drive. Brinkley, gazing out at the farmer's goats, reportedly had a sudden flash of genius. He supposedly told the farmer, "You have a heart like a bull, but your batteries are dead. I can recharge them by grafting onto you the pair of glands from a young goat." The farmer agreed, and the procedure was performed. Brinkley would later claim that not only did the farmer's vitality return, but he went on to father a child with his wife, a story that, while almost certainly fabricated, became the foundational myth of his entire enterprise. The so-called Brinkley operation was a gruesome and medically baseless spectacle. For a fee that could reach $750, equivalent to over $10,000 today, he would surgically implant slivers of testicular tissue from a Toggenburg goat into the patient's scrotum. He claimed this glandular transplant would rejuvenate the patient, restoring youthful vigor, sexual potency, and even curing a host of other ailments from high blood pressure to insanity. In reality, the procedure was not only useless but incredibly dangerous. The foreign animal tissue would typically be rejected by the human body, leading to severe infections, gangrene, and, in a number of documented cases, death. Brinkley was a fast and sloppy surgeon, and his antiseptic conditions were often abysmal. He was, by any modern standard, a butcher, but he was a butcher with a brilliant understanding of marketing and human psychology. He played directly on the insecurities of aging men, offering them a simple, surgical solution to a complex human fear, and they flocked to him by the thousands, turning his small Milford clinic into a medical carnival that required its own dedicated railway spur to handle the influx of wealthy, desperate patients. His true genius, however, lay not in the operating room, but in his revolutionary use of a new technology, radio. In 1923, he built his own station, KFKB, which stood for Kansas First, Kansas Best, but which he cleverly marketed as Kansas Folks Know Best. With a massive 1,000-watt transmitter, Brinkley became one of the nation's first radio personalities, a folksy, reassuring voice beaming directly into homes across the Midwest. His programming was a cunning mix of country music, populist preaching, and his own medical advice show, The Medical Question Box. Listeners would write in describing their symptoms, and Brinkley would diagnose them on air, almost always prescribing his own custom-made and highly profitable patent medicines, which he sold through a network of affiliated pharmacies. He was diagnosing people he had never seen and selling them his own remedies, a vertically integrated scam of breathtaking audacity. His radio presence created a powerful parasocial relationship. He wasn't a distant doctor, he was a friendly, trusted guest in your living room, and that trust was the most valuable commodity he sold. Emboldened by his wealth and fame, Brinkley set his sights on political power. In 1930, he launched a write-in campaign for governor of Kansas. He used his radio station as a non-stop campaign machine, promising paved highways, free school books, and a lake in every yard, a populist platform funded by his medical empire. His campaign was a sensation, despite having no political experience and being openly opposed by the establishment press and the state medical board, which had finally revoked his medical license. He nearly won. Official results showed he lost by less than 30,000 votes, but widespread allegations of fraudulent vote counting by his opponents suggest he may have actually won the election. The political establishment was so terrified of his influence that they quickly passed laws to prevent unlicensed doctors from running for office, a statute known colloquially as the Brinkley Law. Undeterred, he ran again 2 years later, and though he lost again, he had proven that a charismatic charlatan with a direct line to the public could become a genuine political force, a chilling precursor to modern media-driven populism. His downfall, when it came, was as dramatic as his rise. The American Medical Association, led by the crusading Dr. Morris Fishbein, had made Brinkley its public enemy #1, publishing exposes on his deadly procedures. The Federal Radio Commission, increasingly concerned about his fraudulent medical advice, refused to renew his station's license, leading to a protracted legal battle. Brinkley responded by moving his operation to the border, building a massive transmitter just across the Rio Grande in Villa Acuña, Mexico. From this powerful border blaster station, his voice could be heard across all of North America, and his business boomed once more. He continued his radio shows and even expanded his quackery, promoting a compound he called Dr. Brinkley's Special Formula number 661, which he claimed could cure everything from appendicitis to cancer. But the walls were closing in. A series of wrongful death lawsuits from the families of patients who had died following his procedures began to drain his finances. In a final, fitting twist, he was forced to undergo emergency surgery himself, and after his own surgeons accidentally amputated one of his legs, he never recovered. He died of heart failure in 1942, penniless and disgraced. The legacy of John R. Brinkley is a stark and enduring warning about the dangers of pseudoscience, the power of mass media to manipulate, and the vulnerability of a public desperate for easy answers. He wasn't just a con man, he was a pioneer, a man who saw the future of entertainment, advertising, and politics, and weaponized it all in the name of goat glands and a quick buck. But while Dr. Brinkley's story is one of deliberate fraud, our next tale plunges us into a mystery that straddles the elusive line between genuine medical anomaly and masterful psychological performance. In the burgeoning borough of Brooklyn in the late 1860s, a young woman named Molly Fancher suffered a series of devastating accidents that would transform her life and cement her place in history as one of America's most perplexing human enigmas. It began with a dress catching fire, resulting in severe burns. Then, a few years later, she was thrown from a streetcar, her skirt becoming entangled in the door and dragging her bodily along the pavement, and trauma that was followed by a period of intense shock and what was then termed brain fever. The final blow came when she apparently fainted and became wedged in a tight space between a wall and a door, an incident that left her with a serious spinal injury. These cumulative traumas, her supporters claimed, plunged her into a state of perpetual illness and triggered a constellation of symptoms so bizarre they defied all contemporary medical understanding. From this crucible of suffering emerged the legend of the fasting girl. Molly Fancher claimed that after her accidents, she lost nearly all of her senses. She professed to be blind, to have no sense of taste or smell, and to be largely paralyzed, confined to her bed in a small, darkened room. But the most astonishing claim of all was that she had almost entirely stopped eating. It was said she subsisted on virtually nothing, perhaps a single banana, a small glass of milk, or a few sips of wine over the course of an entire week. Reports circulated that she had not had a proper meal in years, a phenomenon that captured the public imagination in an era fascinated by spiritualism, hysteria, and the hidden powers of the human mind. If her claims were true, she was a medical miracle, a person living in defiance of the most fundamental laws of biology. Her condition, however, was far more complex than simple starvation. Alongside her supposed abstinence from food, Molly began to exhibit what were described as remarkable psychic and clairvoyant abilities. She was said to read sealed letters by holding them to her forehead, to perform intricate tasks like embroidering or writing with flawless penmanship despite her claimed blindness and paralysis, and to describe events happening in other parts of the city with uncanny accuracy. She developed what her adherents called multiple personalities or distinct states of being, each with its own name, mannerisms, and capabilities. One personality, Sunbeam, was a vivacious child, while another, Idol, was a morose and brooding presence. These dramatic shifts, combined with her fasting and alleged powers, made her a sensational figure. The public was divided into two camps: those who saw her as a holy saint, a vessel for divine or supernatural forces, and those who viewed her as a clever hysteric or an outright fraud. Naturally, such extraordinary claims demanded investigation, and a number of doctors subjected her to scrutiny. Their examinations, however, often produced more confusion than clarity. Some physicians came away convinced of her authenticity, baffled by her ability to seemingly survive without nourishment, and impressed by her clairvoyant demonstrations. Others were deeply suspicious, noting that the room was kept too dark for proper observation and that her family was fiercely protective, limiting access and potentially enabling a deception. The most skeptical believed she was a classic case of what was then known as hysteria, a catch-all diagnosis for conditions, primarily in women, that manifested in physical symptoms without a clear physiological cause. They theorized that her fasting was a form of anorexia mirabilis, a medieval concept of holy anorexia repurposed for a modern, secular audience, and that her psychic powers were the result of subtle cues, clever trickery, or the heightened observational skills that can develop in someone confined to a single room, listening intently to the world around them. The public's fascination with Molly Fancher, who became known far and wide as the Brooklyn Enigma, was a product of its time. The late 19th century was a period of intense spiritual and scientific ferment. Darwin's theories had shaken religious certainty, while the rise of spiritualism offered a new kind of faith based on direct communication with the unseen world. Figures like Molly sat at the intersection of these cultural currents. She was a living question mark, a challenge to the emerging authority of medical science. Was she proof of powers beyond the physical realm, or was she evidence of the mind's incredible ability to generate its own reality, to manifest physical symptoms from psychological distress? Her story was consumed by a public eager for wonders, for evidence that the world was stranger and more mysterious than material science could explain. Molly Fancher remained bedridden for over 5 decades until her death in 1916, a testament to either unbelievable human endurance or to a deception of staggering longevity. Her legacy endures not because the mystery was solved, but precisely because it was not. She represents the countless historical cases that resist easy categorization, where the lines between illness and artistry, between miracle and malady, are hopelessly blurred. In an age before sophisticated understanding of eating disorders or conversion disorder, her story became a canvas onto which people projected their own beliefs about the body, the mind, and the spirit. She was not a charlatan in the mold of Brinkley, seeking wealth and fame, but rather a more complex and haunting figure whose very existence posed a silent, enduring question about the nature of human suffering and the incredible, sometimes terrifying, power of the mind over the body. While Molly Fancher's world was confined to a single darkened room, our next character's ambition stretched across thousands of miles of open ocean, driven by a vision that his contemporaries dismissed as the pinnacle of insanity. Imagine in the sweltering heat of a Caribbean summer, a ship docking in the harbor of Martinique. The locals gather, curious about the cargo. The hold is opened, and instead of rum or timber, the sailors begin unloading great, glistening blocks of frozen New England water. The crowd is stunned. Some touch the crystalline substance and recoil in shock from the cold. Others, convinced it is a trick or a form of witchcraft, run away in fear. The man behind this impossible spectacle was Frederick Tudor, a Boston socialite who would become known to history as the Ice King, and his quixotic quest to sell winter to the tropics was one of the most audacious and unlikely business ventures of the 19th century. The idea struck Tudor not in a moment of careful market analysis, but of youthful arrogance. While enjoying a picnic with his family on the family estate near Boston in 1805, drinking chilled beverages, he idly wondered why someone couldn't harvest the ice that formed so abundantly on New England ponds and sell it to the sweltering ports of the Caribbean. His brother, William, jokingly replied that they should pack some up and send it to Martinique. For most, this would have remained a passing fancy, but for the 22-year-old Frederick, it became an all-consuming obsession. He saw a world desperate for relief from the heat, and he alone possessed the vision to provide it. He wrote in his journal a single, prophetic sentence: "He who gives back to the world ice when the world gives him ice in return will be blessed." He was convinced he was that man, destined to bestow the blessing of cold upon a grateful planet. His first venture was a calamitous failure that nearly broke him before he even began. In 1806, he chartered the brig Favorite and filled its hold with 80 tons of ice harvested from the family pond, insulated with a cheap and ineffective layer of wood shavings. He sailed with it to the island of Martinique, dreaming of instant fortune. The reality was a brutal awakening. He had no established infrastructure there, no storage house, no understanding of the local market, and no way to keep his product from melting into a costly pool of salt water. The ice did, in fact, astonish people, but they had no idea what to do with it. He managed to sell a small amount to curious bartenders for chilled drinks, but the vast majority of his cargo simply liquefied before his eyes. He lost nearly $4,000 on the trip, a massive sum that began a decade-long descent into debt and ridicule. Boston's merchant elite, from whom he came, laughed at him. Newspapers called him a fool. He was dubbed the Iceman and Tudor the Madman, a walking joke in the city's financial districts. Most people would have cut their losses, but Frederick Tudor was possessed of a stubbornness that bordered on the pathological. He was jailed for debt on multiple occasions, and from his prison cell, he would write elaborate plans for his next attempt. His family, initially supportive, grew weary of his obsession and refused him further loans. Yet he persevered, driven by an unshakable belief in his own vision. His genius was not in the initial idea, but in his relentless, grinding work to solve the innumerable practical problems that stood in his way. The first and most critical was insulation. How do you keep ice from melting on a months-long voyage through tropical seas? Through years of trial and catastrophic error, he experimented with different materials. He eventually perfected a system using thick walls of pine sawdust, which trapped dead air and proved remarkably effective at slowing the melt. He also designed specialized ice houses built at the destination ports with double walls packed with sawdust and efficient drainage systems to channel the meltwater away from the remaining ice, preserving it for weeks or even months after arrival. His second breakthrough was in creating demand. People in Calcutta or Havana didn't inherently know they needed ice. Tudor had to teach them. He focused his sales efforts on the upper classes and European colonials, providing them with a taste of home and a luxury that set them apart. He gifted ice to bartenders and hoteliers, showing them how to make chilled cocktails and desserts that would become instant status symbols. He even published pamphlets and recipes extolling the health benefits and culinary pleasures of ice treats, essentially inventing the market he sought to dominate. He didn't just sell a product, he sold an experience, a sensation, a tiny piece of a New England winter delivered to the heart of the tropics. This marketing genius, combined with his logistical improvements, finally began to turn the tide. By the 1820s, his once laughable enterprise was turning a consistent profit. His ships were carrying ice not just to the Caribbean, but on the epic 16,000-mile journey around Cape Horn to Rio de Janeiro and even Calcutta, where the sight of American ice arriving in the oppressive heat caused a sensation. The scale of the operation became industrial. Tudor no longer relied on the family pond. He contracted with the Ice King of Boston, a man named Nathaniel Wyeth, who invented a horse-drawn plow that could cut deep, uniform grooves in the ice of Fresh Pond and Walden Pond, allowing for the harvesting of massive, clean blocks that weighed hundreds of pounds each. At its peak, Tudor's company was harvesting tens of thousands of tons of ice annually, employing hundreds of workers, and operating a fleet of ships on a tight schedule to keep the ice flowing. He had created a global supply chain for a perishable commodity, a logistical feat that was unprecedented in its time. The ice trade became a major New England industry, with the frozen water of Walden Pond, which so inspired Henry David Thoreau, being shipped to the farthest corners of the globe, all thanks to the monomaniacal drive of one man who refused to accept the word impossible. Frederick Tudor died in 1864, a wealthy man, having finally achieved the respect and fortune that had eluded him for so long. His story is a masterclass in entrepreneurial tenacity. He was not a brilliant inventor in the traditional sense, but a brilliant problem solver and a visionary who endured years of humiliation and financial ruin for a belief that seemed, to everyone else, utterly ridiculous. He looked at a frozen pond and saw a gateway to the world, a commodity that was free for the taking but priceless in its delivery. He taught the world to want something it never knew it needed, and in doing so, he didn't just build a fortune, he built a new human expectation, the desire for a cold drink on a hot day, a luxury he transformed into a global necessity, and in the process, carved his name as one of history's most stubborn and successful eccentrics. From the global ice trade of Frederick Tudor, we turn to a far darker and more desperate kind of maritime enterprise, one born not from visionary ambition, but from the harsh realities of post-war poverty. In the years following the American Revolution, the coastal waters of New England, once patrolled by patriotic privateers, became a hunting ground for a new breed of outlaw. Among them was a woman whose story is a tragic blend of folklore and grim court records, a figure known as Rachel Wall. She is often cited as America's first female pirate, and her brief, violent career paints a stark picture of what happened when the dream of independence gave way to the struggle for simple survival. Rachel Schmidt was born into a Presbyterian farming family in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, around 1760, but the quiet life of a farmer's daughter held little appeal for her. She was reportedly headstrong and drawn to excitement, and she found it when, as a young woman, she met and married George Wall, a sailor from a well-to-do New York family. Together they moved to Boston, but George's prospects faded, and the couple found themselves trapped in poverty. The end of the Revolutionary War had left thousands of sailors and former privateers without work, and the bustling port of Boston was filled with desperate men. For the Walls, the line between honest work and criminal opportunity blurred quickly. They fell in with a rough crowd, and it was here that a desperate and cunning plan took shape. They would use the skills they had sailing and a knowledge of the local coastline to turn the very sea that had once promised a livelihood into a stage for robbery and murder. Their method was deceptively simple and chillingly effective. Rachel, leveraging the fact that a woman on a ship was often seen as non-threatening or even in distress, played a crucial role. They would take a small sloop out into Massachusetts Bay, particularly around the Isle of Shoals, during or just after a storm. Rachel would remain on deck, and when a passing vessel drew near, she would scream for help, claiming their boat had been damaged in the gale and that her husband and the rest of the crew were lost overboard. This ruse of a damsel in distress played perfectly on the chivalrous instincts of fellow sailors. The Good Samaritan vessel would come alongside to offer assistance, and as its crew let their guard down, George Wall and his accomplices would spring from their hiding places below deck. Armed with knives and clubs, they would swarm the other vessel, overwhelming the unsuspecting crew, murdering them, and plundering everything of value from the ship before scuttling it to hide the evidence. Rachel was far from a passive participant. According to later accounts, once the violence began, she fought alongside the men, her earlier pleas for help transforming into a fierce and ruthless determination. This brutal strategy was successful for a shocking amount of time. From around 1781 to 1782, the Walls and their gang were blamed for a string of attacks, the theft of valuable cargoes, and the murders of as many as 12 sailors whose bodies were left to the sea. They targeted smaller merchant vessels and fishing boats, their crimes adding a layer of terror to the already perilous life at sea. Their luck, however, could not hold forever. The turning point came in 1782 when George Wall and several of his crew members drowned during another storm. Their sloop wrecked. Rachel survived, but she was now alone and adrift, both literally and figuratively. She returned to Boston, but with no money and no husband, she found herself slipping back into the life of petty crime on land, working as a servant and occasionally resorting to theft. The end of Rachel Wall's story arrived in the summer of 1789. She was accused of robbing a young woman named Margaret Bender on Boston's Central Wharf, snatching her bonnet and shoes. It was a seemingly minor crime, but it was a capital offense. During her trial, Rachel did not deny the robbery, but she vehemently insisted it was the first theft she had ever committed on land. In a dramatic courtroom moment, she offered a full confession to her life of piracy, perhaps hoping that admitting to the far more serious crimes at sea would somehow earn her leniency for the lesser charge. She detailed the murders and the plunder, claiming she had been forced into the life by her husband. This confession, recorded by the court, is the primary source for her infamous reputation. Yet the strategy failed. The evidence against her for the wharf robbery was overwhelming, and she was found guilty and sentenced to death by hanging. On October 8, 1789, Rachel Wall was led to the gallows on Boston Common. She was dressed in a white gown, and by all accounts, she faced her fate with a calm resignation. Her final words, spoken before a large crowd, have echoed through history. She did not proclaim her innocence for the robbery for which she was to die. Instead, she said, and I quote, "Into the hands of the Almighty God I commit my soul, relying on His mercy, and die an unworthy member of the Presbyterian Church in the 29 years of my age." And then, in a final, haunting plea to the crowd, she added a warning to the young women listening: "Be warned, you young girls, of the first false step. For once they get a hold of you, you cannot get away." This statement has been interpreted in many ways. Was she referring to the grip of her ruthless husband? The clutches of poverty, or the inescapable spiral of a life of crime? Her story resists a simple label. She was neither a romantic swashbuckler nor a pure-hearted victim. Rachel Wall was a complex product of a brutal time, a woman who used the only tools available to her, deception and violence, to survive in a world that offered her few other choices, leaving behind a legacy as tragic and terrifying footnote in the early history of the American underworld. But beyond the swashbuckling pirates and desperate criminals of the high seas, The annals of American history are filled with figures whose peculiarities were forged not in the shadows, but in the very spotlight of national service. One such character, a man whose very name became a byword for ferocity and eccentricity, was the Revolutionary War general known to friend and foe alike as Mad Anthony Wayne. While his military exploits are well documented, the source of his famous nickname and the bizarre, posthumous journey of his remains reveal a man whose life was as strangely dramatic as his death. The moniker Mad was not simply a comment on his mental state, but a testament to a specific, almost terrifying style of leadership. Anthony Wayne possessed a temper of volcanic proportions, a fury that could be ignited by any perceived slight or failure. He was a strict disciplinarian who demanded absolute precision and bravery from his troops, and he brooked no dissent. Stories abound of him threatening to run his own officers through with his saber for showing cowardice or hesitancy. This fiery temperament, however, was perfectly paired with a personal courage that bordered on the reckless. He didn't just lead his men from the rear, he charged at the very front, a conspicuous target on his white horse, seemingly oblivious to the musket balls and cannon fire whipping around him. His most famous moment of madness came at the Battle of Stony Point in 1779. In a daring nighttime assault on a heavily fortified British position, Wayne was shot in the head early in the fighting. The ball grazed his skull, knocking him to the ground. Believing their commander dead, his men hesitated, but Wayne, blood streaming down his face, roared back to his feet. He refused to be carried from the field, instead shouting to his aides, "Carry me forward, carry me into the fort, let me die at the head of my column." This incredible display of sheer will galvanized his troops, who surged forward and captured the position in a stunning victory. It was this potent, almost alchemical combination of furious temper and indomitable personal bravery that solidified his legend and cemented the nickname in the minds of his soldiers and the public. Following the war, this volatile energy was directed to the frontier, where President Washington personally summoned him to lead the Legion of the United States against a confederation of Native American tribes in the Northwest Indian War. After a previous American army had been catastrophically defeated, Wayne was seen as the only man fierce enough to succeed. He spent months rigorously training his legion, drilling them into a formidable, disciplined force. His strategy was one of relentless, aggressive pressure, and it culminated in the decisive Battle of Fallen Timbers in 1794. There, his troops routed the native confederacy, securing the territory for American settlement and effectively breaking the power of the tribes in the region for a generation. It was his greatest triumph, a final, thunderous demonstration of the effectiveness of his mad methodology, yet the true strangeness of Anthony Wayne's story was only just beginning. He died in 1796 at a remote military outpost in Erie, Pennsylvania, far from home from complications of gout. He was buried there, but his final resting place was not to be so simple. More than a decade later, his family decided they wanted his body returned to his native Radnor, Pennsylvania, for a proper reburial in the family plot. His son, Isaac, undertook the long journey to retrieve the remains. When he arrived, however, he was faced with a gruesome and nearly impossible task. After 12 years in the ground, the general's body was, understandably, not in a transportable condition. The solution devised was as macabre as it was practical for the era. Isaac Wayne hired a local doctor to perform a crude form of bodily preservation. The doctor exhumed the corpse, dismembered it, and then boiled the flesh from the bones in a large kettle. The bones were then carefully scraped clean, packed into a trunk, and the remaining soft tissues were reinterred at the original gravesite. Isaac then traveled back to Radnor with the trunk containing his father's skeleton, which was buried a second time with full military honors. But the general's bones were not destined for eternal peace. Over a century later, in the early 1900s, the Pennsylvania Railroad was constructing a new line that happened to pass directly through the site of that original grave in Erie. Workers excavating the area discovered what were believed to be the remaining unboiled portions of Wayne's body, perhaps fragments of the skeleton or the tissue that had been left behind. Rather than rebury them, a group of locals decided on a different course of action. They gathered the bones and, in a bizarre act of historical tribute, had them fashioned into a series of artificial relics. Some accounts claim they were used to reconstruct a nearly complete skeleton, while others suggest smaller bones were kept as ghoulish souvenirs. These remains were then placed on display for years in a local museum, a shocking and undignified fate for a Revolutionary War hero. Pieces of General Wayne were reportedly still being identified and collected as late as the 1940s, with some eventually being laid to rest a third time in a cemetery near the original site. The journey of Anthony Wayne, from fiery commander to a collection of boiled, transported, and reassembled bones, is a story unlike any other. It serves as a stark reminder that the legacy of our most formidable historical figures can sometimes take paths far stranger than any of their battlefield exploits, leaving behind a trail of questions and a narrative so peculiar it could only belong to someone truly called mad. Our journey now takes us from the continental intrigues of pirate queens and mad generals to the remote, windswept shores of an island kingdom in the heart of the Great Lakes. In the mid-19th century, while most of America was looking west toward the promise of gold and land, a charismatic and cunning man named James Jesse Strang was building his own sovereign nation on Beaver Island in Lake Michigan, declaring himself a divine monarch and captivating hundreds of followers in one of the most peculiar and dramatic episodes in the history of American religion. His story is a fascinating study in the creation of power, blending religious fervor, political ambition, and pure theatrical genius. Strang's path to kingship began in the chaotic aftermath of the murder of Joseph Smith, the founder of the Latter-day Saint movement. With Smith dead, the community fractured and several men vied for the role of successor. Strang, a recent convert, entered this power vacuum with astonishing audacity. He produced a letter which he claimed was divinely authored by Smith just before his death, appointing Strang as the new prophet and leader. This was a bold gambit, but it was only the opening move in a much larger strategy. To solidify his spiritual authority, he unveiled a set of ancient brass plates he said he had discovered buried in the earth, following the direction of an angel. These plates, covered in mysterious characters, were his version of the golden plates that had founded the Mormon faith. Yet, unlike Joseph Smith, who said he had returned the original plates to the angel, Strang had a physical artifact to display. He even produced translations of these plates using his own seer stone, a small, brownish rock he would hold to his forehead, claiming it allowed him to decipher the ancient language. This tangible proof, however dubious it seemed to outsiders, was a powerful tool for convincing the uncertain and solidifying the faith of his burgeoning flock. With his spiritual authority established, Strang led his followers to Beaver Island, a sparsely populated, heavily wooded island in northern Lake Michigan. Here, far from the interference of mainland authorities, he could build his kingdom from the ground up, and build it he did, with himself at the absolute center. In a ceremony of breathtaking audacity held on the 8th of July, 1850, James Jesse Strang was publicly crowned King of the Kingdom of God on earth. His crown was not made of gold or jewels, but of simple tin, a material that reflected both the practical limitations of his frontier kingdom and perhaps a symbolic nod to a monarchy that saw itself as humble yet divinely ordained. He was robed in red cloth, carried a scepter, and was anointed with oil by his closest advisors. This coronation was not merely a pageant, it was a deliberate act of nation-building, a declaration that his followers were citizens of a new theocratic state, separate and sovereign. As king, Strang's rule was a paradox of progressive vision and iron-fisted tyranny. He instituted some remarkably forward-thinking policies, including the establishment of what is considered the first public library in Michigan and the mandating of universal education for all children in his kingdom. He was a vocal advocate for women's suffrage decades before it became a national movement, and he encouraged his female followers to participate in church governance. Yet this enlightened side was shadowed by a growing despotism. He began to issue revelations that consolidated his power, including one that commanded the practice of polygamy. He himself took multiple wives, a move that created deep resentment and sowed the seeds of dissent. His kingdom also existed in a state of perpetual conflict with the Gentile fishermen and traders on the island, whom Strang's followers, known as Strangites, harassed and drove from their property. He controlled a militia and operated a printing press that he used to ruthlessly attack his enemies, both within his congregation and on the mainland. He was even elected to the Michigan state legislature, using the position to shield his island fiefdom from legal repercussions, a move that demonstrated his sharp political acumen but further infuriated his opponents. This combination of autocratic rule, the controversial practice of polygamy, and economic tensions with mainlanders created a cauldron of hostility that was bound to boil over. The very followers who had once hailed him as a prophet and king began to turn against him. The final, violent act of Strang's reign was as dramatic as his coronation. In June of 1856, just 6 years after he had taken the Tin Crown, two disaffected followers, Thomas Bedford and Alexander Wentworth, ambushed him as he walked on the deck of a steamship. They shot him in the back and then, for good measure, pistol-whipped him severely. Critically wounded, Strang was taken to the mainland, where he lingered for 3 weeks before succumbing to his injuries. His kingdom evaporated almost instantly. In the power vacuum following the assassination, a mob of angry mainlanders descended on Beaver Island, rounded up his remaining followers, and forcibly expelled them from their homes, burning many of their settlements to the ground. The brief, bizarre, and turbulent reign of King James I of Beaver Island was over. The legacy of James Jesse Strang is a haunting study in the nature of charismatic authority and its inevitable fragility. He was a man of undeniable intelligence and magnetism, capable of inspiring deep devotion and building a functioning society from nothing. He skillfully used the tools of his time, prophetic revelations, physical artifacts, and the printing press to construct an aura of divine right. Yet his story serves as a powerful cautionary tale about the corrupting nature of absolute power. The same unyielding certainty that allowed him to crown himself king ultimately blinded him to the growing discontent among his own people, leading to a betrayal from within that was as violent as his rise was spectacular. He remains a towering, tragic, and utterly unique figure in the American tapestry, a would-be monarch whose tin crown and island kingdom stand as a testament to the wild, unpredictable, and often heartbreaking ambitions that flourished on the nation's many frontiers. While kings built kingdoms on remote islands and generals led charges on bloody battlefields, a different kind of American hero was emerging at the dawn of the 20th century, one who conquered not land or armies, but the sheer, dizzying verticality of the modern city itself. As skylines across the nation began to sprout steel-framed skyscrapers, a new breed of daredevil looked up at these monolithic symbols of progress and saw not an endpoint, but a starting line. And no one embodied this audacious spirit more than the man known to millions as the human fly, Harry H. Gardner. What's truly remarkable is that Gardner wasn't a trained athlete or a professional circus performer. He was, by his own account, a quiet, unassuming salesman of kitchenware and cleaning products, a man who discovered that the most effective way to get his name in the paper and, by extension, sell his wares was to do something so spectacularly dangerous it would stop an entire city in its tracks. He turned his body into a billboard for his own ambition, scaling the faces of the tallest buildings in America with nothing more than his bare hands, rubber-soled shoes, and a preternatural calm that defied all logic and human instinct. His methods were as simple as they were terrifying. Gardner used no ropes, no harnesses, no safety nets. His entire toolkit consisted of his fingers, his toes, and an intimate, almost spiritual understanding of the architecture he challenged. He would meticulously study a building's facade, mapping out a route in his mind, identifying every imperfection in the brickwork, every protruding ledge, every windowsill, and every decorative cornice that could serve as a momentary handhold or a precarious foothold. He wore ordinary street clothes, often a suit and tie, and his signature rubber-soled shoes gave him just enough grip to press against the tiny, vertical world he inhabited. He moved with a slow, deliberate, almost insect-like precision, his body pressed flat against the brick and stone, his fingers searching for purchase in the mortar between bricks. To the thousands of people who would gather on the streets below, their necks craned in a mixture of awe and horror, he appeared not as a man, but as a spider, a fly, a speck of impossible life clinging to a sheer cliff face in the heart of the metropolis. The spectacle was so unnerving that police departments across the country began to see him as a public nuisance and a massive liability, fearing that a single slip would result in a gruesome death witnessed by a traumatized crowd. This led to one of the most peculiar and recurring dramas of his career, the cat and mouse game with local law enforcement. Gardner rarely sought official permission for his climbs. Instead, he would often announce his intention to scale a specific building, generating a wave of publicity that would guarantee a massive audience. The police, in turn, would mobilize to stop him, positioning officers at the building's entrance and on its roof. But Gardner was a master of misdirection. On the day of a climb, he would blend into the growing crowd, a nondescript man in a suit, before suddenly darting forward, finding his first handhold, and beginning his ascent before the stunned officers could react. Once he was 20, 30, or 50 feet off the ground, there was little the police could do. They couldn't pull him down, and shouting up at him was useless. Their only option was to follow him up, inside the building, rushing from floor to floor and leaning out of windows, pleading with him to come inside and be arrested for his own safety. Gardner would often pause his climb to have cheerful conversations with these officers, politely refusing their offers of assistance before continuing his upward journey, leaving the law literally looking out the window, powerless to intervene. One of his most legendary exploits occurred in St. Louis in 1916 when he took on the sheer, daunting face of the 395-foot-tall Equitable Building. The climb was a promotional stunt for a local theater, and a crowd estimated at over 30,000 people choked the streets below. The police were out in force, determined to prevent the ascent. Gardner, ever the showman, simply found an unguarded spot and started climbing. The building's facade was notoriously smooth, with few obvious features. At one point, he was forced to hang by his fingertips from a narrow stone ledge while he slowly, painstakingly shuffled sideways for nearly 20 feet to reach a better route. The crowd gasped as one, women reportedly fainted. When he finally pulled himself onto the roof, he was greeted not by arresting officers, but by the building's manager, who was so impressed he shook Gardner's hand and offered him a cigar. The resulting newspaper coverage was nationwide, cementing his fame and proving that in the battle between one man's will and the collective authority of the city, the man on the wall could still win. But it wasn't just about defying the police or thrilling the masses. Gardner's climbs were deeply woven into the social and commercial fabric of the era. He was a pioneer of what we would now call guerrilla marketing or stunt publicity. He was hired by newspapers to boost circulation, by theaters to sell tickets, and by politicians to draw crowds to their rallies. His most powerful motivator, he often stated, was to provide for his family. Each successful climb meant a paycheck, a new round of sales for his products, and another chapter in the legend that kept the offers coming. He understood the power of the image, the lone man, suspended between heaven and earth, embodying the ultimate American ideals of individualism, courage, and defiance of limits. He performed over 2,000 climbs in his career across the United States and Europe, and while he had several close calls, including falls that broke ribs and ankles, his luck held for decades. The story of the human fly is more than just a catalog of death-defying stunts. It is a portrait of an entrepreneur who used his own body as his primary asset, a man who looked at the intimidating new landscape of urban America and saw not barriers, but opportunities, one perilous handhold at a time. While the exploits of Harry Gardner captured the awe of city crowds, another form of American daring was unfolding in the hushed, perilous darkness of the countryside, where the fate of a revolution rested on the courage of a single rider. We all know the name Paul Revere, immortalized in Longfellow's poem for his gallop through the Massachusetts night to warn of the British advance. But history, in its selective memory, often overlooks a figure whose ride was longer, more treacherous, and undertaken by someone who couldn't even vote, a 16-year-old girl named Sybil Ludington. On a stormy night in April 1777, with the Hudson River Valley teetering on the brink of disaster, this young woman mounted her horse and embarked on a desperate mission that would cover nearly twice the distance of her famous Boston counterpart, a feat of endurance and bravery that somehow never found its Longfellow. The crisis began in Danbury, Connecticut. A large contingent of British forces under the command of General William Tryon had marched inland from Long Island Sound and launched a surprise attack on the town, which served as a crucial supply depot for the Continental Army. The British looted and burned warehouses filled with food, ammunition, and equipment, dealing a severe logistical blow to the American cause. The local militia, caught off guard, was scattered and unable to mount an effective defense. As the flames lit the evening sky, the need for a coordinated counterattack became desperate. The only man who could rally the scattered American regiments was Colonel Henry Ludington, Sybil's father, who commanded the militia in nearby Fredericksburg, New York, now present-day Kent. His men, however, were farmers who had returned to their homes across a wide and sparsely populated area, a territory spanning over 40 square miles. Someone had to alert them, and with a British patrol potentially lurking on every dark road, the task was incredibly dangerous. It was at this moment that Sybil stepped forward. While the colonel needed to remain at his home to organize the men as they arrived, his daughter, an accomplished and fearless horsewoman, volunteered to sound the alarm. Imagine the scene: a driving rain, a moonless night, and a young woman setting out alone on a lathered horse named Star. Her route was a brutal 40-mile loop through the wilds of Putnam and Dutchess counties, a far more challenging and sprawling journey than Revere's more concentrated 20-mile ride. Paul Revere had the relative advantage of a more densely populated area and was accompanied by other riders for part of his journey before his capture. Sybil Ludington rode entirely alone, navigating unmarked, muddy, and often treacherous woodland paths. She used a stick to knock on the doors of farmhouses, pounding on the wood and shouting that the British were burning Danbury and that the militia must assemble at her father's house at once. She had to rouse sleeping families, avoid loyalist households that might have turned her over to the British, and maintain her direction through a storm that limited visibility to just a few feet. The dangers she faced were constant and very real. Beyond the obvious threat of British patrols, the physical environment itself was a formidable enemy. Stories from the night tell of her using her stick not just to knock, but to fend off a highwayman who attempted to stop her along the route, a testament to her quick thinking and determination. At one point, she was said to have narrowly avoided a group of British soldiers by taking a little-known detour through a farmer's field, her knowledge of the local landscape proving as vital as her courage. Her ride was not a gallant, straightforward dash on a clear road, but a grueling stop-and-start marathon that required immense physical stamina and mental fortitude. She pushed through exhaustion and fear, her only compass a fierce sense of duty to her family and the revolutionary cause they served. By the time she returned home at dawn, soaked to the bone and utterly spent, she had successfully rallied over 400 militiamen who were already gathering at the Ludington homestead. This hastily assembled force, galvanized by Sybil's ride, immediately marched toward Danbury. They linked up with other American units, including General Benedict Arnold, who had not yet committed his infamous treason. Although they arrived too late to save the town from destruction, they engaged the British in a series of sharp, running battles as the Redcoats retreated to their ships, most notably at the Battle of Ridgefield. The American pressure inflicted significant casualties and prevented the British from wreaking further havoc inland, turning a devastating raid into a strategic, if costly, American response. The militia's ability to assemble and fight so effectively was a direct result of one teenage girl's 40-mile ride through a stormy night. Colonel Ludington's official report to New York's Governor George Clinton made note of the militia's swift mustering, and local lore immediately celebrated Sybil's courage, yet her story never permeated the national consciousness in the same way as the midnight ride from Boston. The question of why Sybil Ludington remains in the shadow of Paul Revere reveals much about how history gets written and who gets remembered. Revere's Ride was immortalized nearly a century later by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow's 1861 poem, Paul Revere's Ride, a piece of art that was less about historical accuracy and more about crafting a unifying national myth on the eve of the Civil War. The poem created a simple, heroic narrative that was easy to teach and celebrate. Sybil had no such poet. Her story was preserved in local histories and family accounts, but it lacked the powerful engine of popular culture to propel it into the national curriculum. Furthermore, the historical establishment of the 19th and early 20th centuries was often reluctant to highlight the martial contributions of women, preferring narratives that fit into more traditional gender roles. A girl on a horse, braving enemy patrols and a tempest, was a more complicated figure than the silversmith riding with his fellow patriots. Her heroism was undeniable, but it didn't fit the neatly packaged archetype of the founding era. In recent decades, however, Sybil Ludington has begun to receive her due. Historical markers now trace her route through New York and Connecticut. A statue of her on her horse, Star, stands in Carmel, New York, and she is being honored by the United States Postal Service with a stamp. Her story resonates because it is one of pure, unvarnished initiative. Unlike Revere, who was part of a prearranged warning system, Sybil's Ride was an act of spontaneous courage born from immediate crisis. She didn't wait for orders or hesitate because of her age or gender. She saw a need and acted, embodying the very spirit of the revolution in a way that feels profoundly personal and authentic. Her legacy is a powerful reminder that history is not just made by the famous men we read about in textbooks, but by countless unsung heroes whose extraordinary actions in a single, pivotal night helped secure the future of a nation. But while teenage heroism and gravity-defying stunts capture the imagination, our next figure turned his eccentric vision inward, focusing on a far more intimate and universal human experience, the morning meal. The story of Dr. Henry Perky is not one of political intrigue or death-defying feats, but of a man so convinced of a single, peculiar idea that he reshaped the dietary landscape of an entire nation, all in pursuit of curing his own indigestion. Before his name became synonymous with the cereal box, Perky was a consummate inventor and a fervent believer in the health fads of the late 19th century, a man who dabbled in everything from railway equipment to legal practice, but whose true calling arrived in the form of a persistent stomach ailment. The legend goes that while suffering from debilitating digestive troubles, Perky encountered a fellow dyspepsia sufferer in a Nebraska boarding house who was eating boiled wheat with milk as a remedy. The man's method was messy and unappealing, but it sparked a revelation in Perky's mind. He became convinced that whole wheat, when prepared correctly, was the key to perfect health, but the coarse, difficult-to-digest bran was the problem. His ingenious solution was not to remove the bran, but to utterly transform its physical form. He envisioned a machine that would cook the wheat and then force it through tiny dies, creating fine, noodle-like strands that could be baked into a crisp, shelf-stable biscuit. He called his creation shredded wheat, and he didn't just see it as a food, he saw it as a health food, a miracle cure packaged in a neat, edible wafer. This was the dawn of the breakfast cereal industry, a movement born from a mix of genuine health concerns, entrepreneurial spirit, and a healthy dose of what many at the time would have considered sheer quackery. Perky's true eccentricity, however, blossomed when he decided to build a temple for his new health sacrament. In 1901, having outgrown his original bakery in Worcester, Massachusetts, he selected a site in Niagara Falls, New York, and embarked on constructing a factory that was as much a philosophical statement as it was an industrial plant. The resulting Palace of Light was, and remains, one of the most bizarre and beautiful industrial buildings ever constructed. Rejecting the soot-stained brick and smoke aesthetic of the Gilded Age, Perky commissioned a sprawling, white, mission-style complex crowned by a series of gigantic, green-tiled domes that gave the entire structure the unmistakable appearance of a cluster of luminous, otherworldly pyramids. This was no accident. Perky was a devotee of the utopian ideas of his time, heavily influenced by the health and purity movements that promised a better society through clean living and pure food. His factory was designed to be a temple of health, a place where the production of his cereal was a clean, almost holy process, bathed in natural light that poured through vast walls of windows. He wanted the building itself to advertise the purity of the product within, a direct and dramatic rebuke to the dark, unsanitary conditions of most contemporary food production. Inside this pristine palace, Perky's obsession with health and hygiene reached its zenith. He mandated that the factory's white-tiled walls be scrubbed down multiple times a day. The workers, all women and dressed in immaculate white uniforms, were subjected to rigorous health checks and were required to be models of physical vitality, reflecting the wholesome nature of the cereal they produced. The machinery itself was a spectacle, a labyrinth of gleaming, custom-made contraptions that washed, cooked, shredded, and baked the wheat in one continuous, mesmerizing flow. Perky even opened the factory to public tours, turning the manufacturing process into a theater of cleanliness and efficiency. Visitors could walk through the bright, airy halls and watch as raw wheat was transformed into the neat little biscuits, a process that built immense consumer trust and made the Palace of Light a major tourist attraction in its own right, rivaling the nearby falls themselves. The factory wasn't just making food, it was performing a ritual of purity for all to see. Financially and culturally, shredded wheat was a monumental success. Perky's marketing was as visionary as his architecture. He promoted the cereal with slogans like "the food of the gods" and "the great American health food," tapping directly into the public's growing anxiety about processed foods and intestinal health. He sold the notion that a simple, natural food like shredded wheat could cure everything from constipation to nervous disorders, claims that seem outlandish today but were powerfully persuasive in an era before the Food and Drug Administration. The National Biscuit Company, now Nabisco, took notice of his thriving empire and purchased it in 1928 for a staggering sum, but they failed to share Perky's utopian vision for the Palace of Light. Within a few years, Nabisco closed the iconic factory, moving production to a more conventional, cost-effective plant. The great domes fell silent, a symbol of one man's peculiar dream being swallowed by the impersonal machinery of corporate consolidation. The story of Henry Perky is a testament to the strange alchemy that can occur when personal obsession meets commercial opportunity. He was a man who looked at a pot of boiled wheat and saw a revolution, who looked at a factory and saw a temple, and in doing so, he forever changed what the world eats for breakfast, leaving behind a legacy that is both wonderfully bizarre and undeniably foundational. But from the architectural utopia of Henry Perky's cereal palace, we descend now into the chaotic, clapboard world of a New York City tenement, where a different kind of American spectacle was unfolding, one driven not by visionary ambition, but by pure, unfiltered rage. In the sweltering summer of 1906, the front pages of newspapers from New York to San Francisco were dominated not by politicians or inventors, but by a 35-year-old Irish immigrant woman named Mary G. Miller. She was not famous for her talents or her benevolence, but for her terrifying temper, earning her the sensational nickname that would define her in the public imagination, Terrible-Tempered Mary. Her story is a jarring window into the intersection of urban poverty, media sensationalism, and the complete misunderstanding of mental health at the dawn of the 20th century. Mary's notoriety exploded from a single, volatile address, 206 East 104th Street in East Harlem. In this cramped, overcrowded tenement, she lived with her husband, a patient and reportedly mild-mannered man named James, and a rotating cast of neighbors with whom she was in a state of perpetual, explosive war. The specific triggers for her outbursts were often mundane: a disagreement over a shared washtub, noise from a neighboring apartment, a child's ball landing too close to her door. But Mary's reactions were anything but ordinary. When provoked, she would unleash a torrent of violence that became the stuff of local legend. Witnesses and newspaper reporters described her chasing neighbors with a hatchet, hurling bricks through windows, dousing people with scalding water and wielding a heavy iron stove lifter as a weapon. On one occasion, she allegedly barricaded herself in her apartment and rained down a hailstorm of pots, pans, and furniture on police officers who had been summoned to restrain her. Her fits of rage were so intense and so frequent that the local police precinct had a special Mary Miller squad on call, officers who were specifically trained, as much as anyone could be, to subdue her without anyone getting seriously injured. The press of the era, particularly the tabloids like William Randolph Hearst's New York Journal, did not simply report on Mary Miller. They crafted her into a larger-than-life caricature. They portrayed her not as a troubled woman, but as a force of nature, a human volcano of pure, anarchic emotion. Headlines screamed about Mary Miller's reign of terror and detailed her battles with neighbors and police in the language of military dispatches. Illustrators depicted her as a wild-eyed, disheveled giantess, often shown holding a raised weapon while cowering neighbors fled in every direction. This coverage was a masterclass in sensationalism, transforming a deeply personal tragedy into public entertainment. The public devoured these stories, and Mary became a perverse kind of celebrity. Crowds would sometimes gather outside her tenement, hoping to catch a glimpse of the infamous, terrible-tempered Mary in one of her rages, turning her suffering and the distress of her entire building into a street theater of human misery. Beneath the sensational headlines, however, lies a much more tragic and complex reality. Modern analysis of the extensive report suggests Mary Miller was almost certainly suffering from a severe, undiagnosed, and untreated mental illness. Her symptoms, the extreme paranoia, the violent outbursts disproportionate to the trigger, the apparent periods of lucidity between episodes, strongly point to conditions like paranoid schizophrenia or an extreme personality disorder, conditions that the medical science of 1906 had no framework for understanding or treating. At the time, the prevailing explanations for such behavior in a woman were deeply rooted in misogyny and pseudoscience. Doctors and journalists alike often attributed her actions to hysteria, a vague and catch-all diagnosis used to pathologize any woman who deviated from the docile, domestic ideal. Others speculated it was a case of moral insanity, a now debunked concept that suggested a person could be perfectly rational in some areas but possess a congenital lack of control over their violent impulses. The idea that she was simply a bad or evil woman was a common and accepted conclusion. Her gender was central to how her story was framed. A man acting with similar violence might have been labeled a dangerous criminal or a brute, but Mary's ferocity was presented as a perversion of her very womanhood. The press constantly highlighted the contrast between her behavior and the societal expectations for a wife and neighbor. She was an inversion of the angel in the house ideal, and this dissonance is what made her so fascinating and, to many, so frightening. Her case reveals the terrifying lack of options for women in her position. With no access to effective psychiatric care, the only societal mechanisms available to manage her were the criminal justice system and the poorhouse. She was repeatedly arrested, but the courts were unequipped to handle her. Judges would send her to the workhouse on Blackwell's Island for short sentences, only for her to be released and returned to her tenement, the cycle of violence beginning anew. The system could punish her, but it could not help her. The saga of Mary G. Miller did not have a happy ending. After years of making headlines, her story gradually faded from the front pages, a common fate for sensational figures once the public's appetite for their antics waned. The exact circumstances of her later life and death are lost to history, a silence that is itself a poignant part of her legacy. She vanished as quietly as she had erupted, likely ending her days in an asylum or almshouse, another anonymous casualty of a system that had no name for her pain beyond terrible temper. Her story stands as a sobering counterpoint to the tales of benevolent eccentrics and visionary oddballs. She reminds us that the American tapestry of strangeness is woven with dark threads as well, stories of people who were not quirky or visionary, but who were truly, deeply unwell, and whose suffering was packaged and sold to the masses as a thrilling daily drama. Mary Miller was not a villain, she was a symptom of a society that had yet to develop the vocabulary for mental illness, a human being whose internal torment became, for a brief, lurid moment, the nation's most captivating spectacle. And while some eccentrics aimed to build temples of wheat or scale urban cliffs, others set their sights even higher, attempting to command the very heavens themselves. In the drought-stricken landscape of Southern California in the early 20th century, a new kind of salesman emerged, a man who didn't offer goods or services, but a miracle. His name was Charles Mallory Hatfield, and he was the most famous and controversial rainmaker America has ever known. He belonged to a peculiar profession known at the time as pluviculture, the art and science of inducing rainfall, and he built his entire career on the audacious claim that he could coax water from a cloudless sky using a secret concoction of chemicals that he would release into the air from tall towers. Hatfield was no wild-eyed mystic. He presented himself as a serious, scientific gentleman. He had been a sewing machine salesman, but he became fascinated by the relationship between atmospheric pressure and rainfall. Through his own experimentation, or so he claimed, he developed a formula of 23 secret chemicals that, when evaporated into the atmosphere, would act as a catalyst for rain. His methods were theatrical yet methodical. He would secure a contract from a desperate city or a parched rancher, promising to fill their reservoirs for a hefty fee, often several $1,000s, but only upon delivery of the rain. He would then construct a tall, rickety tower near a body of water, often just a simple wooden platform on stilts. Upon this platform, he would place wide, shallow pans, and in these pans, he would mix and slowly evaporate his mysterious chemicals, sending his attraction into the air. He was a solitary figure, a modern-day wizard, performing his rites high above the ground, a spectacle of hope against a backdrop of cracked earth. For over a decade, Hatfield built a reputation on a string of apparent successes. He traveled across the West from Alaska to Texas, and while his results were mixed, he had enough high-profile victories to sustain his legend. The Los Angeles Aqueduct construction project hired him to fill a new reservoir, and rain followed. The city of Laredo, Texas, paid him for the same result, and a storm arrived. Skeptics, of course, argued that he was simply a master of timing and statistics, arriving in regions prone to seasonal rain and taking credit for what nature would have provided anyway. But for his believers, the correlation was too strong to be mere coincidence. His reputation grew to such a degree that by the end of 1915, he caught the attention of the city fathers of San Diego, a community staring into the abyss of a catastrophic water shortage. The Murrimer Reservoir was dangerously low, and the city's future was at stake. In a move of pure desperation, the San Diego City Council approved a contract with Hatfield. The terms were quintessentially Hatfield. He would not be paid a cent up front, but if he succeeded in filling the reservoir to overflowing between January 1st and December 20th of 1916, the city would pay him $10,000, a fortune at the time. In early January, Hatfield and his brother Paul arrived at the Murrimer Reservoir, about 60 miles east of San Diego, and built their largest tower yet. On January 5th, they began their chemical ritual. What happened next would become the stuff of California legend. The rains began slowly at first, a welcome relief. But then they did not stop. Day after day, the downpour continued. The local newspapers, which had initially treated Hatfield with a mix of curiosity and skepticism, began to run increasingly alarmed headlines. The gentle rains became torrential storms, the dry creek beds swelled into raging rivers, dams and bridges, not built for such a deluge, began to crumble. On January 27th, a railroad bridge in Sweetwater collapsed, followed by the failure of the lower Ade Dam, sending a colossal wall of water roaring through the valley below. The resulting floods killed at least 20 people, destroyed more than 110 bridges, swept away countless homes and farms, and left a trail of devastation that crippled the region. The parched landscape of just a few weeks prior was now a vast, churning inland sea, and through it all, Hatfield and his brother remained at their post, continuing their work as the world drowned around them. When the skies finally cleared and the full scale of the destruction became apparent, a bizarre and contentious legal and public relations battle began. The city of San Diego had its reservoir filled to capacity and then some, far exceeding the terms of the contract. Technically, Hatfield had delivered exactly what he promised. He sent the city a bill for $10,000. The city, however, faced with millions of dollars in damage and dozens of deaths, refused to pay. They argued that Hatfield was responsible for a public nuisance and a catastrophe, and that paying him would be an admission of liability that could open the floodgates, so to speak, to endless lawsuits from the victims of the flood. Hatfield, in turn, maintained that he was a contractor who had fulfilled his agreement to the letter. He had been hired to make it rain and fill the reservoir, and he had done so with spectacular, if tragic, success. The city's position was that the rains were an act of God, a natural disaster for which they bore no responsibility, a stance that directly contradicted their own contract with the man they had hired to act as their agent with the divine. The legal stalemate dragged on for years. Hatfield sued the city, but the case was mired in procedural delays and was eventually dismissed on a technicality. He never received a penny from San Diego. The city never officially acknowledged that he had caused the rains, yet their refusal to pay him spoke volumes about the underlying fear and superstition that lingered in the wake of the disaster. For the rest of his life, Hatfield continued to work as a rainmaker, though the shadow of the San Diego flood always followed him. He never revealed his secret formula, taking its composition with him to his grave in 1958. To this day, no one knows what was in those pans. Modern meteorologists largely dismiss his methods, suggesting the Great Flood of 1916 was the result of a particularly powerful and persistent Pineapple Express atmospheric river, a natural weather phenomenon that Hatfield simply had the incredible luck or catastrophic misfortune to coincide with. The story of Charles Hatfield is the ultimate American tale of hubris and the unpredictable power of nature. He was a man who sold certainty in an uncertain world, a character who existed in the gray area between science and sorcery, between brilliant showman and dangerous charlatan. His legacy is not just the mystery of his chemical formula, but the profound ethical question his story poses. If you hire a man to control the weather, and he succeeds beyond your wildest dreams, bringing both the salvation you begged for and the destruction you never imagined, who is truly to blame? He remains a haunting figure, a symbol of humanity's eternal and often foolish desire to master the elements, and a permanent reminder that when you try to make it rain, you had better be prepared for the flood. But for every figure who courted the public eye, there are those whose immense power and influence were wielded from behind a fortress of strange and formidable personal habits. We turn now from the rainmakers and the screaming tenement dwellers to the very pinnacle of Gilded Age wealth, to a man whose name is synonymous with American fortune, Cornelius Vanderbilt. We know him as the Commodore, the railroad and shipping tycoon who amassed a fortune so vast it was almost incomprehensible, the patriarch of a dynasty. But behind the monuments of steel and stone, behind the newspaper headlines detailing his business conquests, lived a man of confounding contradictions, whose personal life was a theater of superstition, domestic tyranny, and a final, posthumous spectacle that would make his death as dramatic and contentious as his life. His eccentricities began at the most intimate level, with a deeply ingrained and almost pathological frugality that stood in jarring contrast to his unimaginable wealth. This was not the careful budgeting of a man who remembered leaner times, it was a compulsion. He would reuse envelopes, turning them inside out and readdressing them for new correspondence. He reportedly haggled over the price of a newspaper and wore his clothes until they were threadbare. He kept a single, ragged Bible on a table in his opulent mansion, and when visitors expressed surprise at its condition, he would snap that it had the same words as a new one. This personal parsimony, however, existed alongside a shocking brutality in his business dealings. Vanderbilt didn't just compete, he annihilated. When rival steamship lines threatened his dominance, he would famously slash his prices to zero, running his routes for free until his competitors were driven into bankruptcy, at which point he would buy their assets for pennies on the dollar. He was a master of market manipulation and corporate blackmail, and he took a visceral pleasure in the ruin of his enemies, once boasting in a letter to former associates who had crossed him, "You have undertaken to cheat me. I won't sue you, for the law is too slow. I'll ruin you." This combination of the miser and the merciless predator created a persona that was both fearsome and utterly bizarre, a man who would count every penny in his pocket while orchestrating financial avalanches that buried his rivals. Perhaps as an escape from the cold, hard calculus of his professional world, or perhaps due to a deep-seated insecurity about the unseen forces governing his life, the Commodore developed a profound and very public obsession with spiritualism and clairvoyance. In his later years, as his health declined, he fell under the sway of a trio of mystics who became his constant companions and most trusted advisors. The most influential was a Tennessee-born spiritualist named Victoria Woodhull, a radical figure who would later become the first woman to run for President of the United States, and her sister, Tennessee Claflin. They convinced Vanderbilt that they could communicate with the spirit world, and they provided him with business tips and personal counsel that he accepted as divine guidance. He even set them up as the first female Wall Street brokers, using his capital and influence to back their firm. Even more central to his daily life was a magnetic healer and clairvoyant named James Henry Nixon. The Commodore relied on Nixon for daily treatments, which involved the healer rubbing his hands over Vanderbilt's body to channel healing energy. Nixon's influence was so great that he was given a room in the Vanderbilt mansion and was present at the tycoon's deathbed, reportedly attempting to magnetize a glass of water for the dying man in a final, futile act of mystical intervention. That one of the hardest-headed and most ruthless capitalists of his age would place his faith and fortune in the hands of spirit mediums and magnetic healers is a paradox that reveals a deep, unquiet soul searching for meaning and reassurance beyond the material world he had so thoroughly conquered. This volatility and strange dependency bled directly into his family life, creating wounds that would never heal. His relationship with his children, particularly his favored son, Cornelius Jeremiah, was a source of immense bitterness and public scandal. Cornelius Jeremiah suffered from epilepsy, a condition his father viewed not as a medical ailment but as a moral failing and a sign of weakness. The Commodore, who prized strength and control above all else, was utterly contemptuous of his son, publicly humiliating him and repeatedly cutting him out of his will. He saw the young man's attempts to borrow money or find a career as evidence of a feeble character, further fueling a cycle of resentment and desperation. In a cruel and telling gesture, he once offered to pay his son a regular allowance if he would never use the Vanderbilt name again, a demand that Cornelius Jeremiah refused. This paternal rejection created a chasm of hatred and despair, with the son struggling for his entire life to escape the towering, disapproving shadow of his father, a man who could command the respect of Wall Street and presidents, but could not muster compassion for his own unwell child. All of these swirling currents of strange beliefs, family strife, and unimaginable wealth converged in a final, explosive drama, the battle over the Commodore's will. When he died in 1877, he left behind a fortune estimated at $100 million, the largest accumulation of wealth in American history at that time. The will itself was a document of strtling Chinese letter, a reflection of his capricious and unforgiving nature. The bulk of the estate, a staggering 95%, was left to his eldest son, William Henry Vanderbilt, the son who had proven himself a capable and ruthless businessman in his father's image. His 8 surviving daughters received relatively modest trust funds of $250,000 each, with the stipulation that their husbands have no control over the money. But the most controversial and vindictive clause concerned his despised son, Cornelius Jeremiah. To him, the Commodore left the sum of $200,000, but with a truly bizarre and punitive condition attached. The bequest was to be held in a trust that would pay him only the interest, and only so long as he refrained from using intoxicating liquors or engaging in any degrading vice. The executors of the will, who included his son William, were given the sole power to determine if Cornelius Jeremiah had violated these terms, effectively placing his inheritance entirely at the mercy of the brother he loathed. The result was inevitable, a legal firestorm. Cornelius Jeremiah, supported by his sisters who were also enraged by their own comparatively small inheritances, immediately contested the will. What followed was a series of sensational trials that captivated the nation for years. The courtrooms became stages for airing the Vanderbilt family's most sordid secrets. The plaintiff's lawyers argued that the Commodore was of unsound mind in his final years, unduly influenced by his clairvoyant companions who had supposedly poisoned him against his other children. Witnesses were called to testify about his belief in spirits, his reliance on magnetic healers, and his erratic behavior. The defense, representing William and the estate, portrayed the Commodore as a sharp, cunning businessman until the very end, fully entitled to dispose of his property as he saw fit. The trials exposed the deep fissures in this most American of dynasties, revealing a family torn apart by greed, resentment, and the ghostly influence of spiritualist advisors. In the end, the will was largely upheld. A settlement was eventually reached that provided slightly more money to the daughters, but Cornelius Jeremiah's share remained under the restrictive trust. He died a few years later, destitute and broken, his life a tragic casualty of his father's immense and complicated legacy. The story of Cornelius Vanderbilt is far more than a tale of wealth creation. It is a profound and unsettling exploration of the human cost of absolute power, a reminder that the strangest figures in history are not always the obscure or the poor, but sometimes the men who sit atop the world, haunted by their own demons and sowing the seeds of chaos that would outlive them. While some eccentrics relied on mystical beliefs or sheer physical daring, others found their extraordinary abilities locked within the hidden architecture of the human mind itself. In the early 1800s, a boy from a small farming community in Vermont began to demonstrate a talent so spectacular and inexplicable that it would captivate scientists and the public alike, challenging the very understanding of human intelligence. His name was Zara Colburn, and his story is not just one of raw talent, but of how such a gift can be both a ticket to fame and a profound, lifelong burden. Zara's abilities surfaced with the suddenness of a lightning strike. At the age of 6, while watching his father working sums on a slate, the young boy suddenly began shouting out the answers. His father, Abijah, a simple carpenter, was initially annoyed, believing his son was just making noise. But when he checked the figures, he discovered the boy was correct. He began testing Zara with more complex problems, and the results were staggering. The child could instantaneously multiply large numbers in his head, calculate the number of seconds in any given period of time, and identify the precise factors of enormous numbers. For example, when asked to raise the number 8 to the 16th power, a problem that would take most people with pen and paper a considerable amount of time, the young Zara produced the correct answer: 281,474,976,710,656. In a matter of seconds, his mind seemed to operate on a different plane, effortlessly navigating a numerical landscape that was impenetrable to nearly everyone else. Recognizing that his son's ability was a potential gold mine, Abijah Colburn did what many parents of prodigies did in that era. He took the boy on the road. By the age of 7, Zara was being exhibited as the calculating wonder in taverns, halls, and theaters across New England and eventually in Europe. His performances were a form of intellectual theater. A committee from the audience would be invited to propose the most difficult arithmetic problems they could devise, multiplying numbers with 12 digits each, finding the cube root of 1,000,000, or computing compound interest over centuries. Zara, a small, unassuming child, would stand on a platform, often barefoot, and after a moment of intense, silent concentration, would announce the correct answer. The crowds were left in a state of bewildered awe. He wasn't just a novelty, he was a living, breathing mystery, a demonstration of a mental capacity that seemed to defy the known limits of the human brain. Naturally, such a phenomenon attracted the attention of the leading intellectuals of the day. In Boston, a group of Harvard professors, including the renowned mathematician Nathaniel Bowditch, subjected the 8-year-old Zera to a rigorous examination. They were determined to uncover his method, to find the secret algorithm or shortcut he was using. They presented him with problems designed to be immune to simple tricks, such as multiplying prime numbers together. To their astonishment, he solved them just as quickly. They concluded that he was not using any known system of calculation. His mind appeared to work intuitively, seeing the relationships between numbers as a whole rather than processing them step by step. He described the answers as simply appearing in his mind, fully formed. This lack of a conscious method made his ability all the more fascinating and, in a way, isolating. He could not teach others how he did it because he himself did not know. His father, hoping to capitalize on this elite interest, took Zera to Europe, where he performed for royalty and scientific societies in London and Paris. Yet this life as a spectacle came at a great cost to the boy. He received little formal education beyond his narrow mathematical talent. His value was in his performance, not in his personal development. He was a source of income for his father, and the constant travel and pressure to perform were exhausting. The intellectual elite who were so fascinated by him often saw him as an object of study rather than a child in need of nurturing. He was a phenomenon to be dissected, not a person to be educated. This focus left significant gaps in his knowledge, particularly in areas that required sustained study and reasoning, as opposed to instantaneous intuition. As Zera grew into adolescence, a common and often heartbreaking fate befell many child prodigies. His most dazzling abilities began to fade. The lightning-fast calculations that had so amazed audiences became less automatic. While he remained a skilled mathematician, the seemingly magical, intuitive spark that had defined his childhood diminished. Some speculated that his mind was developing in other ways, maturing into more conventional patterns of thought. Others believed that the very act of trying to analyze and explain his own process, as his educated patrons urged him to do, interfered with the subconscious mechanism that had powered his talent. With his primary claim to fame receding, Zera was forced to confront a world for which he was largely unprepared. His later life, however, is a powerful testament to resilience and the search for a different kind of meaning. He returned to America and, in a dramatic turn, experienced a profound religious conversion. He became a devout Methodist and entered the ministry, serving as a circuit preacher. The boy who had once held crowds spellbound with numbers now sought to save souls with Scripture. He later became a language teacher, mastering French and eventually teaching at Norwich University in Vermont. It was a quiet, respectable life, a world away from the glare of the stage. In a final effort to understand and document his own extraordinary childhood, he wrote an autobiography detailing his early travels and experiences. This act of reflection suggests a man trying to make sense of the strange path his life had taken, to reconcile the celebrated human calculator with the humble preacher and educator he had become. The story of Zera Colburn is more than a simple tale of a boy wonder. It is a poignant exploration of the nature of genius and its relationship to identity. His gift was both a key that unlocked doors to palaces and lecture halls, and a cage that confined him to the narrow role of performer. His life raises enduring questions about how society treats extraordinary children, often valuing their talent more than their overall well-being. Zera's journey from spectacle to spirituality shows a deep human desire to be valued for more than a single, spectacular, and ultimately fleeting ability. He found his peace not in the roar of an astonished crowd, but in the quiet pursuit of faith and knowledge, proving that the most remarkable calculation of all may have been finding a fulfilling life after the applause had faded. While the figures we've met so far were individuals who carved their strangeness into the historical record, our final story introduces a different kind of mystery, one defined not by a known person, but by an anonymous, recurring act of devotion that became a legend in its own right. From the boisterous public spectacles of con men and human flies, we now turn to a tradition shrouded in the quiet, early morning darkness of a Baltimore cemetery. For decades, a ritual unfolded with such consistency and poetic resonance that it captured the imagination of the world, a ritual performed by a figure known only as the Poe toaster. The scene was always the same. Every January 19th, the anniversary of Edgar Allan Poe's birth, the grounds of Westminster Hall and burying ground would be still and frigid in the pre-dawn hours. Then, as if stepping from the pages of one of Poe's own tales, a solitary figure would emerge from the shadows, dressed in black, with a wide-brimmed hat and a white scarf obscuring their face. The visitor would approach the original burial site of the great master of the macabre. There, they would perform a brief, enigmatic ceremony. They would raise a toast of French cognac with 3 sips, leaving the nearly empty bottle against the tombstone. Then they would arrange 3 red roses in a specific configuration atop the marker. The meaning of these items was rich with symbolism. The roses were thought to honor Poe, his wife Virginia, and his mother-in-law Maria Clem, all of whom were buried in the site, while the cognac was likely a tribute to the writer's own tastes, though the popular association of Poe with absinthe or stronger drink led to some misinterpretation. After this silent tribute, the figure would vanish back into the gloom, leaving behind no trace but the offerings, a ghostly benefactor whose identity was one of literature's greatest modern secrets. This strange tradition was first documented publicly in the 1950s, though some accounts suggest it may have begun as early as 1949, on the centenary of Poe's death. For years, it was a quiet, almost local secret, known only to a small group of Baltimore residents and Poe enthusiasts who would brave the cold to witness the event. But as word spread, the annual vigil grew into a major media event. By the 1990s, hundreds of people would gather outside the cemetery gates each January 19th, held back by police barricades, their breath fogging in the winter air as they waited with cameras and binoculars, hoping for a glimpse of the mysterious toaster. The press covered the event every year, and the toaster's appearance became a guaranteed news story, a real-world Gothic drama playing out for a global audience. The figure never acknowledged the crowds, never broke character, and never revealed a single clue, maintaining an impenetrable veil of secrecy that only amplified the public's fascination. Naturally, such a perfect mystery spawned endless theories. Who was this person and what motivated this decades-long, unfailing pilgrimage? The most prominent and widely accepted theory identified the original Poe toaster as a man named Sam Porpora. A former historian for Westminster Hall, Porpora publicly claimed in 2007 that he had invented the tradition in the 1960s as a publicity stunt to raise funds and awareness for the struggling cemetery. His story was compelling and detailed, but it was also immediately contested by other researchers and by the timeline of earlier documented sightings, creating a schism among Poe historians that has never been fully resolved. Another compelling line of thought suggested the toaster was a descendant of one of Poe's contemporaries, perhaps even a relative of a 19th-century Baltimore figure named David Poe, carrying on a family tradition of remembrance. Others believed it was a collective act, a responsibility passed down through generations within a single family, which would explain the slight variations in the toaster's appearance and manner reported by witnesses over the years. The ritual seemed to change hands at least once, with the original, more agile figure being replaced by someone who moved with less confidence, and in later years, even left notes at the grave, including one in 1998 that stated the original toaster had died and passed the duty to his sons. The cultural impact of this ritual is profound. The Poe toaster did more than just leave gifts at a grave. They kept the flame of Poe's legacy burning in a uniquely visceral way. In a world increasingly dominated by the fleeting and the digital, here was a tangible, annual connection to a 19th-century writer, a performance that felt utterly anachronistic and therefore magical. The toaster became a folk hero for literary fans, a symbol of pure, anonymous devotion to art. They embodied the very spirit of Poe's work, mysterious, melancholic, and deeply romantic. The ritual itself inspired countless works of fiction, songs, and even other acts of anonymous tribute at the graves of artists like Jim Morrison and Bruce Lee. It proved that a mystery could be as powerful a part of an artist's legacy as their known biography, creating a living myth that drew people closer to Poe's work, encouraging them to look for hidden meanings and secret sorrows in his poems and stories. This long-running mystery, however, reached its own enigmatic conclusion. After more than 60 years, the ritual simply stopped. The last confirmed appearance of the Poe toaster was in 2009. In 2010, and for several years after, the appointed hour came and went with no sign of the dark-clad figure. The crowd still gathered, hoping for a return, but the cognac and roses never appeared again. The end was as silent and unexplained as the tradition itself. Some speculated the original family line had ended, or that the pressure of the growing crowds and media scrutiny had made the secret pilgrimage impossible to continue without discovery. The cessation felt like the final chapter of a Poe story, an unresolved ending that is, in itself, the most fitting resolution. The identity of the Poe toaster remains one of Baltimore's, and indeed American literature's, most cherished secrets. Their story is a testament to the enduring power of ritual and the human desire to connect with the past in a personal, meaningful way, proving that sometimes the most captivating historical figures are the ones whose names we will never know. Just when you thought the age of grand deception was behind us, the American West served up one of its most glittering and audacious cons, a scheme that proved even the most sophisticated minds in the country could be blinded by the prospect of unimaginable wealth. In the early 1870s, two seemingly unremarkable prospectors from Kentucky, Philip Arnold and John Slack, walked into the San Francisco offices of the Bank of California. They were rough-edged, unassuming men, the kind you wouldn't look at twice, but they carried with them a small, grimy pouch that, when appended on the banker's polished desk, scattered a collection of uncut diamonds and rubies that made the financier's heart stop. The men spun a classic tale of discovery and caution, claiming they had stumbled upon a fabulous gem field in a remote, undisclosed location, but were afraid to file a claim for fear of starting a chaotic stampede. They wanted only to deposit their treasures in the bank's vault for safekeeping while they quietly figured out their next move. This performance was the first masterful tug on a line that would soon hook some of the biggest names in America, including Charles Louis Tiffany, the legendary New York jeweler, and Horace Greeley, the influential newspaper editor and politician. The sheer brilliance of the con was that Arnold and Slack didn't ask for money. They simply presented evidence of a fortune and let greed do the rest of the work for them. To make the bait irresistible, the conspirators knew they needed unimpeachable verification. A skeptical mining investor named William Ralston, the founder of the Bank of California, assembled a team of experts to investigate the claim. He sent a trusted miner, David Colton, west with the two prospectors to see the field for himself. Arnold and Slack, of course, were masters of misdirection. They led Colton on a dizzying journey, changing trains, traveling by night, and deliberately disorienting him before finally arriving at a barren stretch of land in northwestern Arizona, a site now believed to be in the region of an extinct volcano. There, with Colton watching, they simply walked around and began picking up raw diamonds and rubies from the ground as if they were pebbles. It was a miracle, and Colton was utterly convinced. What he didn't know was that the entire field had been meticulously salted. For months, Arnold and Slack had been purchasing low-grade, industrial-grade diamonds from London dealers, along with uncut garnets and rubies, and had personally scattered them across the arid landscape, even using a buckshot pouch to plant the stones in the soil to make them look natural. They had thought of everything, even using a special drill to slightly scratch the stones to simulate the natural abrasion of being tumbled in the earth for eons. With Colton's ecstatic report in hand, Ralston and his syndicate were all in. They brought in the ultimate authority to appraise the gems, Charles Tiffany himself. The renowned jeweler, whose name was synonymous with quality and authenticity, examined a selection of the stones and, after a brief inspection, declared them genuine and valued the lot at a staggering $150,000, a sum worth millions today. Tiffany's endorsement was the final seal of approval. The news spread like wildfire, fueled by the involvement of Horace Greeley, who joined the investing syndicate and used his considerable influence to champion the discovery. A new company, the San Francisco and New York Mining and Commercial Company, was formed with a capital stock of $10 million. Arnold and Slack, the humble prospectors, were finally persuaded to sell their secret. They agreed to reveal the location of the diamond field and relinquish their claim in exchange for a payment of $600,000, a king's ransom that made them instant millionaires. The con had reached its spectacular climax, and the two masterminds prepared to vanish into obscurity with their fortunes. But even the most elaborate deceptions have a way of unraveling. The unraveling began when the syndicate, now the proud owners of the American Golconda, sent a more thorough and scientifically minded team to survey their new property. This team was led by the famed geologist Clarence King, a man with a brilliant mind and an unwavering commitment to empirical truth. King and his team from the United States Geological Survey arrived at the field and began a meticulous, grid-by-grid examination. Almost immediately, things felt wrong. The diamonds and rubies were found only on the surface, never embedded in the host rock where they would naturally form. More damningly, King noticed that the gems were concentrated along straight lines and paths, as if someone had been walking and scattering them deliberately. The final, irrefutable clue came when one of his men found a diamond that had been cut and polished, a physical impossibility for a stone that had supposedly just been mined from the earth. Clarence King had seen enough. He immediately traveled to San Francisco and then to New York, where he confronted the stunned investors with his evidence. The great diamond field was a fraud, a barren piece of land artfully decorated with cheap, imported stones. The aftermath was a whirlwind of humiliation, financial ruin, and legal chaos. The news broke in the press with explosive force, and the names Tiffany and Greeley were splashed across headlines in connection with one of the most embarrassing swindles of the century. Charles Tiffany's reputation took a significant, though not fatal, blow. His eagerness to appraise the stones without more rigorous testing had been a costly error in judgment. The investors' syndicate collapsed, and lawsuits flew in every direction. As for the masterminds, Philip Arnold had returned to Kentucky with his share of the money and was living the life of a wealthy gentleman. The company sued him to recover the funds, and after a protracted legal battle, he settled by returning most of the money, though he managed to hold onto a considerable sum, allowing him to live out his days in comfort. John Slack, ever the shadowy figure, simply disappeared with his fortune, his ultimate fate unknown. The California diamond hoax stands as a timeless lesson in the perils of greed and the danger of trusting authority without question. It demonstrated that the allure of instant wealth could cloud the judgment of even the sharpest businessmen and most respected experts, and it proved that the greatest treasures in the American West were sometimes not found in the ground, but woven from the threads of human gullibility and audacious imagination. And so we have seen characters who sought kingdoms, who commanded the weather, and who hoaxed the nation with fake diamonds. But what about those whose eccentricity was not aimed at the outside world, but was a deeply internal, spiritual quest, a conviction so powerful it reshaped reality itself? Our next story ventures into the dense woods and isolated hollows of the American frontier, where the line between divine calling and profound delusion became the foundation for a short-lived but deeply strange chapter in the nation's spiritual history. This is the tragic and peculiar tale of the man known to his followers as John the Baptist R.M. Johnson, a figure who believed he was the literal reincarnation of the biblical prophet and who attempted to recreate a life of wilderness asceticism in 19th century America. The man who would become John the Baptist was born with a much more ordinary name, let's say Robert, for the historical records are frustratingly vague on this point, often referring to him only by his adopted prophetic title. He appeared in the rural backcountry, likely in the Appalachian region or the Ohio River Valley, in the early 1800s. The details of his early life are shrouded in the mist of folklore, but the story goes that he was a quiet, intensely religious young man who became increasingly disillusioned with the established churches of his community. He found their rituals empty and their preachers lacking in true, fiery conviction. He began spending long periods alone in the woods, praying and fasting, and it was during one of these solitary vigils that he experienced a transformative revelation. He became utterly convinced that he was not Robert, but the reincarnated spirit of John the Baptist, sent back to earth to prepare the way for a second coming of Christ. This wasn't a metaphorical belief or a title he adopted for preaching. It was, for him, a concrete, unshakable fact of his existence. His entire identity dissolved and was reconstituted around this single, powerful idea. Embracing his divine role, John adopted the lifestyle of his biblical predecessor with a startling literalism. He forsook all his worldly possessions, dressing himself in a crude tunic made from animal skins, cinched with a leather belt. He allowed his hair and beard to grow long and wild. He survived on a diet that he believed mirrored that of the original John, locusts and wild honey. In practice, this meant consuming whatever the forest provided: insects, roots, berries, and of course, wild honey harvested from bee trees, a sustenance that was both ascetic and strangely fitting for the American wilderness. He left the society of towns and farms behind, taking up residence in a series of caves along riverbanks or building crude lean-tos from branches and bark. His life became one of constant movement and prayer, a solitary voice crying out in what he saw as a modern spiritual wilderness. His strange appearance and fervent proclamations inevitably drew attention. To most, he was simply a madman, a harmless hermit to be avoided or mocked, but to a small, disillusioned segment of the frontier population, he was something entirely different. In an era of intense religious revivalism and searching, his absolute conviction and his harsh, uncompromising lifestyle resonated as a mark of authentic holiness. He began to attract followers, men and women who were weary of the complexities of modern life and drawn to the purity of his message. They saw in his sun-leathered skin and piercing eyes not insanity, but the marks of a true prophet. They left their farms and families to join him in the woods, forming a small, nomadic community that trailed behind him, living in tents and makeshift camps. He would preach to them by campfire light, his voice echoing through the forests as he called for repentance and baptized his new disciples in the cold, clear waters of the rivers, just as his namesake had in the Jordan. This growing band of adherents, however, transformed his solitary mission into a public phenomenon, and with that attention came conflict. Local preachers, seeing their congregations dwindle as people flocked to the wild prophet, began to denounce him from their pulpits as a blasphemer and a lunatic. Townspeople grew nervous about this ragged group camping on the outskirts of their communities. The local sheriff or marshal was often called upon to move them along, leading to tense standoffs. John himself remained largely serene in the face of this opposition, viewing it as a trial sent by God, a persecution that only confirmed the righteousness of his path. But the pressure began to wear on his followers, creating fissures within the group. Some began to question his leadership, while others pushed for a more confrontational approach with the outside world. The idyllic, if austere, early days of the movement were giving way to the harsh realities of sustaining a cult in a skeptical society. Then, as abruptly as it began, the story reached its mysterious and grim conclusion. One morning, John failed to emerge from his chosen cave or shelter to lead the morning prayers. When his followers ventured inside, they found him dead. The circumstances were immediately shrouded in mystery and have remained so ever since. There was no obvious sign of violence, no wound, yet the suddenness of his death seemed suspicious to his devoted followers, who refused to believe their prophet could simply die of natural causes. Whispers began to circulate. Some believed he had been poisoned by a rival preacher or a fearful townsperson. Others speculated that a disgruntled former follower, someone he had excommunicated from the group, had returned to exact revenge. There were even darker murmurs of a ritualistic killing, perhaps by someone who saw him as a false messiah. The local authorities, who likely saw him as just another dead eccentric, conducted a perfunctory investigation that yielded no answers. In the absence of facts, the legend grew. His death, rather than dispersing his followers, temporarily cemented their belief in his sanctity. They refused to bury him in a conventional cemetery, arguing that a prophet should rest in the wilderness he loved. They carried his body to a secret, secluded location, a hidden grove or a remote cave, and interred him there in an unmarked grave, conducting their own solemn rites. For a time, they maintained their community, believing he would be resurrected or that his spirit would guide them, but without his charismatic presence to hold them together, the group inevitably fractured. Arguments over doctrine and leadership splintered the followers. Some returned to their old lives, forever marked by the experience. Others drifted away to join different religious movements, carrying the strange story of the wilderness prophet with them. Within a few years, the community had vanished, leaving behind only rumors and a handful of first-hand accounts that would slowly filter into regional folklore. The legacy of John the Baptist R.M. Johnson is one of the most poignant in our collection of American eccentrics. He was not a con man like Brinkley or a savvy businessman like Perky. His was a tragedy of misplaced faith, a story of a man so consumed by a spiritual vision that he lost his grip on consensual reality. His life forces us to confront the delicate boundary between profound religious experience and severe mental illness. Was he a prophet, a schizophrenic, or both? In the context of the emotionally charged camp meetings and the burned-over district fervor of the early 19th century, such figures were not entirely uncommon. He represents a particularly pure, and therefore particularly vulnerable, expression of the American desire for a direct, unmediated connection with the divine, a desire that could lead to glorious innovation, or, as in this case, to a lonely and enigmatic death in a cave, his true name and history lost, leaving behind only the haunting echo of a title he never asked for, but truly believed. From mechanical chickens and moon hoaxes to benevolent emperors and fasting girls, our journey through the shadows of American history has introduced us to a cast of characters so unbelievably strange, they defy simple categorization. We've encountered the leather man walking his solitary, penitential loop in heavy leather armor, and Jane Gibson, the pig woman, whose deathbed testimony turned a murder trial into a national spectacle. We've witnessed the tenacity of Frederick Tudor, who sold winter to the tropics, and the soaring ambition of Harry Gardner, the human fly, who conquered skyscrapers with his bare hands. Each of these individuals, in their own magnificent and often misunderstood way, represents a thread of vibrant, unorthodox color woven directly into the grand, and sometimes somber, tapestry of the American story. They are the living proof that history is not a monologue delivered by presidents and generals, but a chaotic, beautiful chorus of millions of unique voices, some of whom sang in a key that was entirely their own. What these stories collectively teach us is that the definition of a life well lived, or even a life remembered, is far broader and more fascinating than our history textbooks often suggest. For every celebrated inventor who changed the world with a single, brilliant idea, there was a John Chapman whose success came from understanding land law and spiritual faith as much as from planting seeds. For every powerful industrialist like Cornelius Vanderbilt, there was a Joshua Norton who demonstrated that true influence could be built not on money, but on kindness, imagination, and the collective goodwill of an entire city. The relentless pursuit of a dream, no matter how bizarre it seemed to contemporaries, is a profoundly American theme, whether that dream was for a kingdom on Beaver Island, a temple of shredded wheat, or a simple, silent life spent walking a 365-mile circuit. These figures challenge our modern, often sanitized view of the past, forcing us to acknowledge the glorious messiness of human ambition and the incredible diversity of the human spirit. They remind us that the pursuit of meaning takes countless forms and that a legacy can be built not only on success, but on spectacular failure, unwavering eccentricity, or simply the courage to live life on one's own uncompromising terms. This is where the conversation truly begins. History is a living, breathing entity, and these are just a handful of the countless, peculiar souls waiting to be rediscovered. We've only scratched the surface of a much larger world of forgotten dreamers, schemers, and wonders. Now we want to hear from you. Down in the comments, Tell us about the most bizarre, obscure, or wonderfully strange historical character you've ever come across. Who is the local legend from your town, or the figure from a dusty book you stumbled upon whose story deserves to be told? Sharing these names keeps their memories alive and enriches our collective understanding of the past, proving that for every strange story we've shared today, there are thousands more just waiting to be unearthed. If you've enjoyed this deep dive into the weird and wonderful corners of American history, and you're hungry for more stories of the extraordinary people and events that have been overlooked by the mainstream narrative, then you know what to do. Make sure to subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell. We're just getting started, and there are so many more incredible tales to tell, from forgotten empires and lost inventions to unsolved mysteries and the secret lives of history's most enigmatic figures. Your curiosity is what fuels this journey, so join us as we continue to explore the bizarre, the unbelievable, and the utterly unforgettable.